The Chosen One's Wrath. Chapter 1. The Stranger's Warning. The evening air hung heavy with summer heat as Eryon Matthews locked up the small accounting firm where he worked. Main Street was quiet in the small town of Oak Ridge, with only a few people hurrying home before darkness fell completely. Eryon loosened his tie and started his usual walk home, his mind already on the leftover pasta waiting in his refrigerator. A sudden chill swept through the warm air. Eryon paused, glancing around. The streetlights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the pavement. From an alley between the pharmacy and the bookstore, a hooded figure emerged. "Eryon Matthews," the figure said, voice distinctly feminine despite its softness. He stopped, hand instinctively tightening on his briefcase. "Do I know you?" The woman stepped closer. Her face remained hidden beneath her hood, but Eryon caught a glimpse of pale skin and eyes that seemed to reflect light like a cat's. "You're the chosen one," she said simply, as if commenting on the weather. "The darkness stirs. The ancient evil rises once more, and the world stands on the precipice of destruction." Eryon let out a nervous laugh. "Look, I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm just an accountant. The blood of Eltharion flows through your veins," she continued, undeterred. "The dreams have already begun, haven't they?" A chill ran down Eryon's spine. The strange dreams that had plagued him for weeks, visions of battles and blood, of creatures that shouldn't exist. How could she know about those? "I don't know what you're talking about," he said firmly. "Please leave me alone." He quickened his pace, not looking back until he reached his apartment building. The woman was nowhere to be seen. That night, the dreams came again, more vivid than ever. Eryon found himself standing on a hill overlooking a modern city. The skyline was familiar, Chicago perhaps, or New York. But something was wrong. Fires blazed throughout the metropolis, and the sound of screams carried on the wind. From the north, a vast army approached. Creatures with grey skin and tusked mouths, orcs his mind supplied, though he'd only seen such things in fantasy movies, marched alongside shambling corpses with glowing blue eyes. Tanks and helicopters attempted to halt their advance, but modern weapons seemed to have little effect. The dead kept walking even as bullets tore through them, and the orcs shrugged off injuries that would kill a human instantly. A woman stood beside him on the hill, her face obscured but somehow familiar. "This is what comes," she said. "This is what you must prevent." Eryon woke gasping, sheets drenched in sweat. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The dream felt more like a memory than a nightmare, and the woman's words echoed in his mind. The next evening, Eryon left work early, hoping to avoid another encounter with the strange woman. He took a different route home, cutting through the park. The sun was still up, and families played on the grass. Normal, safe. A man sat on a bench ahead, reading a newspaper. As Eryon passed, the man lowered his paper, revealing a face crossed with scars. "You can't run from destiny, Eryon Matthews," the man said, his voice gravelly. Before Eryon could respond, the man's eyes widened. He lunged forward, shoving Eryon to the ground. Something whistled through the air where Eryon had been standing. The scarred man grunted, a black arrow protruding from his chest. "The awakening has begun," he gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "They know you live." The man collapsed. Behind him stood a massive figure, at least 7 feet tall, with greenish skin and yellow tusks protruding from its lower jaw. It held a crude bow, already knocking another arrow. Eryon scrambled backward, unable to process what he was seeing. The creature, an orc, just like in his dream, snarled and raised its bow. A flash of silver cut through the air. The orc's head separated from its body, both parts falling to the ground with a heavy thud. The hooded woman from the previous night stood there, a curved blade in her hand. "We need to move," she said urgently, grabbing Eryon's arm. "More will come." What was that thing?" Eryon stammered, looking at the creature's corpse. Already it seemed to be dissolving into black smoke. "Later," she said, pulling him toward the trees. "Right now, we run." As they fled, Eryon glanced back at the park. Families continued their activities, seemingly oblivious to the violence that had just occurred. It was as if they couldn't see the dead man or the vanishing orc corpse. Why isn't anyone reacting? He gasped as they ran. The veil still holds, barely, the woman replied. They cannot see what they are not ready to see. They reached the edge of the park, where a nondescript van waited. The woman opened the side door and pushed Eryon inside. You can't run from destiny, she said, climbing in after him. The time for denial is over, Eryon Matthews. The world needs its champion. As the van pulled away, Eryon caught a final glimpse of the park. Where the scarred man had fallen, only empty grass remained. Chapter 2. The Camp of Survivors. Eryon drifted in and out of consciousness as the van travelled through the night. The woman had given him water that tasted strangely sweet, and drowsiness had overcome him despite his fear and confusion. Fragments of conversation reached him, mentions of safe passage and the boundary weakening, but nothing that made sense to his addled mind. When he finally awoke fully, sunlight streamed through a canvas roof above him. He lay on a cot in what appeared to be a large tent. His suit had been replaced with simple clothes, a linen shirt, sturdy pants, and leather boots that fit surprisingly well. The sleeper awakens, said a deep voice. Eryon turned to see a stocky man with a braided beard sitting on a cibility nearby. No, not a man, a dwarf, his mind supplied incredulously. The figure couldn't have been more than 4.5 feet tall, but his upper body was powerfully built, with arms corded with muscle. Where am I? Eryon asked, his throat dry. Who are you? You're in the last safe haven in the Eastern Territories, the dwarf replied, offering a water skin. As for me, I'm Commander Tharok, military leader of this sorry band of refugees and warriors. Eryon drank deeply, then looked around the tent. Simple furnishings, a weapons rack holding swords and bows, maps spread across a table. This isn't possible, he muttered. Dwarves aren't real. Orcs aren't real. Tharok laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. Tell that to the orc that nearly put an arrow through your heart yesterday, or to my ancestors, who've been mining the Ironback Mountains for 10,000 years. The tent flap opened, and the hooded woman entered. In the daylight, with her hood pushed back, Eryon could finally see her clearly. She was tall and slender, with high cheekbones and pointed ears that peeked through long silver hair. Her eyes were almond-shaped and violet, definitely not human. You're an elf, Eryon said flatly, too overwhelmed for further surprise. Calith, she corrected, of the Silverleaf clan, and yes, what your people call elves. My people, Eryon repeated. You mean humans? Humans who have forgotten the old world, Tharok interjected. Your ancestors knew of us, fought alongside us, traded with us. Then the veil was created and your kind forgot. Calith sat on the edge of the cot. How much do you remember of your dreams, Eryon? The question caught him off guard. They're just dreams. They're memories, she said gently. Memories of past lives, of battles fought and lost. You are the reincarnation of Eltharion, the champion who has faced the darkness in every age. Eryon laughed bitterly. I'm an accountant. I've never even been in a fistfight. The soul remembers what the body does not, Calith replied. Come, see the camp. Perhaps that will help you understand what we face. Outside, Eryon blinked in the bright sunlight. The tent was one of dozens arranged in concentric circles around a central clearing. People, humans, elves and dwarves, moved purposefully between them, carrying supplies, training with weapons, or tending to the wounded. Beyond the camp, a vast forest stretched in all directions, with mountains visible in the distance. Where are we? Eryon asked, trying to orient himself. This doesn't look like anywhere near Oak Ridge. We're between, Tharok said cryptically. Not fully in your world, not fully in ours. The boundary lands where the veil is thinnest. As they walked through the camp, Eryon noticed the diversity of the inhabitants. Humans of all ethnicities worked alongside the elves and dwarves. Some wore modern clothing, while others dressed in what looked like medieval garb. They're like me, he realized. From my world. Calith nodded. Some are refugees who saw through the veil when the attacks began. Others are warriors who chose to fight. All have lost something to the darkness. They reached the central clearing, where a group of young men and women trained with wooden swords under the watchful eye of a scarred elf. This is what remains of the resistance, Tharok said grimly. 300 fighters, maybe 100 more support personnel, against an army of thousands. What army? Eryon asked. What exactly are we fighting? Calith's expression darkened. Vorthar, the god of endless night. Every 1,000 years he attempts to break free from his prison and consume both our worlds. His servants, the orcs, goblins, and undead, are merely the vanguard. And I'm supposed to stop this? Eryon couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. How? That, said Tharok, is what we need to figure out. But first, you need to remember who you are. The dwarf led them to a smaller tent at the edge of the camp. Inside, a circular table held a single item, a sword in a worn leather scabbard. This belonged to Altharion in his last incarnation, Calith explained. Touch it. See if it remembers you. Hesitantly, Eryon reached for the sword. As his fingers closed around the hilt, a jolt of energy surged up his arm. Images flashed through his mind. A battlefield strewn with bodies, a tower of black stone, a creature of shadow with glowing red eyes. He drew the blade without thinking. The metal gleamed silver in the dim light, runes etched along its length glowing faintly blue. Stormcaller, he whispered, the name coming to him unbidden. Tharok and Calith exchanged glances. He remembers, the dwarf said. Parts, Calith cautioned. The awakening has only begun. Eryon stared at the sword in his hand, feeling both its unfamiliarity and a strange sense that it belonged there. I don't know how to use this, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, his grip adjusted naturally on the hilt. Your mind doesn't, Tharok agreed, but your soul does, and we'll help the rest of you catch up. The next weeks passed in a blur of training and education. Each morning, Eryon practiced swordsmanship with Tharok and archery with the elves. Afternoons were spent learning the history of the conflict with Vorthar and studying maps of both worlds. Evenings brought strategy sessions with the camp's leaders. His body, soft from years behind a desk, protested at first. Blisters formed and broke on his hands, muscles he didn't know he had screamed in agony. But gradually, day by day, he grew stronger. The sword became an extension of his arm, and movements that had once felt awkward became fluid. Through it all, Calith remained his constant companion. She pushed him harder than the others, accepting no excuses, allowing no rest when he faltered. Yet in quiet moments, he caught glimpses of something else in her violet eyes. Concern, perhaps, or a sadness that seemed older than her apparent years. One evening as they sat by a campfire after a particularly grueling day, Eryon finally asked the question that had been bothering him. Why me? What makes me special? Calith stared into the flames. The soul of Altharion chooses its vessel carefully. Courage, compassion, the capacity for sacrifice. These qualities draw it like a moth to flame. I'm not courageous, Eryon argued. I lived a safe, boring life, never took risks. Perhaps that's why you were chosen this time, she replied. The cycle has repeated for millennia. Altharion fights Vorthar, wins temporarily, but the darkness always returns. Maybe a different approach is needed. You knew him, didn't you? Eryon asked suddenly. The last Altharion. Calith's expression tightened. Elves live long lives, Eryon. I have fought in many battles against the darkness. That's not what I asked. She met his gaze, and for a moment the mask of the stern warrior slipped. Yes, she said softly. I knew him. I loved him. And I watched him die. The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Before Eryon could respond, horns blared from the perimeter of the camp. Attack! Came the shout. Eastern boundary! All warriors to arms! Calith was on her feet instantly, sword in hand. Stay here, she ordered Eryon. You're not ready. But as she ran toward the sound of battle, Eryon found himself following, Stormcaller drawn and gleaming in the moonlight. Ready or not, the time for training was over. Chapter 3. The attack and the awakening chaos erupted throughout the camp as warriors rushed to defend the eastern perimeter. Eryon followed Calith, struggling to keep pace with her fluid movements. The sounds of battle grew louder, clashing metal, war cries, and something else, a high-pitched shriek that raised the hair on his arms. They reached the edge of the camp where the forest began. Torches illuminated a nightmarish scene. A horde of creatures poured from between the trees, orcs with crude weapons, smaller goblin-like beings darting between them, and behind them, shambling figures with rotting flesh and glowing blue eyes. The camp's defenders had formed a ragged line, elves firing arrows from behind a barricade while humans and dwarves engaged the enemy directly. Commander Tharok stood at the center, wielding a massive warhammer that crushed any creature that came within reach. "Get to the command tent," Calith shouted to Eryon over the din. "Help evacuate the wounded!" Before he could respond, she leapt into battle, her twin blades flashing in the torchlight. 3 orcs fell in as many seconds, black blood spraying from severed arteries. Eryon turned toward the command tent, but his path was cut off by a goblin that had broken through the line. The creature snarled, revealing needle-sharp teeth, and lunged with a rusted dagger. Without thinking, Eryon sidestepped and swung Stormcaller. The blade connected with the goblin's neck, cleaving through with surprising ease. The creature collapsed, its head nearly severed. Eryon stared at his hands in shock. The movement had felt natural, almost instinctive, as if his body remembered what his mind did not. No time to dwell on it. More creatures were breaking through. Eryon found himself defending a group of healers as they evacuated children from a nearby tent. His sword moved with increasing confidence, each strike more precise than the last. "Get them to the tunnels!" shouted an elven healer, pushing a group of wide-eyed children toward Eryon. "The western exit is still clear!" Eryon nodded, gathering the children, human, elf and dwarf, and leading them away from the fighting. They reached the western edge of the camp where a concealed trapdoor led to underground tunnels. "Go," he told the oldest, a human boy of perhaps 12. "Follow the blue markers. They'll lead you to the secondary camp." As the last child disappeared below, Eryon turned back toward the battle. The defenders were being pushed back steadily, their line fragmenting under the relentless assault. He spotted Calith surrounded by undead, her blades a silver blur as she fought to keep them at bay. Even from a distance, Eryon could see she was tiring, her movements fractionally slower than before. Without hesitation, he ran toward her, cutting down anything in his path. A strange energy seemed to flow through him, guiding his sword, strengthening his limbs. He reached Calith's side just as an orc chieftain, larger than the others, wearing crude armor made of bones, approached from her blind side. "Behind you!" Eryon shouted. Calith spun, but too late. The chieftain's blade slipped past her guard, plunging into her side. She gasped, violet eyes widening in shock and pain. "No!" Eryon screamed, lunging forward. The orc chieftain turned to meet him, yellow teeth bared in a grotesque smile. Their blades met with a shower of sparks. The creature was immensely strong, driving Eryon back step by step. Calith collapsed to her knees, silver blood staining the ground beneath her. "Eryon!" she gasped, her voice barely audible above the battle. "Don't lose yourself!" Something snapped inside Eryon at the sight of her fallen form. Rage unlike anything he had ever experienced surged through him, but beneath it was something else, power, raw and ancient, awakening from dormancy. His vision tinged with blue light. Stormcaller's runes blazed like captured lightning. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Enough!" The word carried power. The nearest undead stumbled, blue light flickering in their eyes. The orc chieftain hesitated, uncertainty replacing bloodlust in its pig-like eyes. Eryon raised Stormcaller above his head. Lightning crackled along the blade, arcing into the sky. Storm clouds formed from nowhere, swirling above the battlefield. "I am Eltharion, Stormbringer, Shield of the Realms," he intoned, the words coming unbidden to his lips. "By ancient right and blood I command you, begone!" He brought the sword down. Lightning struck from the clouds, channeling through the blade and exploding outward in a blinding wave of energy. The blast rippled across the battlefield, disintegrating undead, flinging orcs and goblins like rag dolls. When the light faded, silence reigned. Where enemies had stood moments before, only ash remained, swirling in a sudden wind. Eryon stood unmoving, Stormcaller still crackling with residual energy. The defenders stared at him in awe and fear. Even Tharok seemed at a loss for words. The power receded slowly, leaving Eryon light-headed and disoriented. He dropped to his knees beside Calith, who lay motionless on the blood-soaked ground. "Calith," he whispered, gathering her in his arms. "Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with difficulty. "You remembered," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I knew you would." "Don't talk," Eryon said urgently. "We'll get you to the healers." She shook her head slightly. "Too late for that. Listen to me, Eryon. The power you just wielded, it comes with a price. Eltharion's greatest strength was always his compassion, not his magic. Don't lose that. Don't lose yourself to the rage." "I don't understand," Eryon said, tears blurring his vision. "You will," she whispered. Her hand reached up to touch his face. "I have waited lifetimes to find you again. Perhaps in the next cycle." Her voice trailed off. The light in her violet eyes dimmed, then extinguished. Her hand fell away from his face. "No," Eryon murmured, then louder. "No!" He clutched her body to his chest, rocking back and forth as sobs tore through him. The sky darkened further, lightning flashing between roiling clouds. Rain began to fall, washing blood and ash into the earth. A hand fell on his shoulder. He looked up to see the hooded woman from his first night in Oakridge, the one who had warned him, who had brought him here. Her face, previously hidden, was now visible, ageless, beautiful, with the same violet eyes as Calith. "Now you understand," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "You are the chosen one, but power comes at a price." "Who are you?" Eryon asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. "I am Calith," she replied. "From a time yet to come. The cycle is breaking, Eryon. The boundaries between past, present and future grow thin. I came back to warn you, to prepare you." "For what?" Her gaze shifted to the body in his arms. "For this moment, for the choice that follows. The rage you feel now, it can consume you, turn you into something you were never meant to be, or it can forge you into the hero this world needs." Eryon looked down at Calith's still face, peaceful in death. Then at Stormcaller, its blade now dark, its power dormant once more. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "The future." Calith's expression softened with compassion. "That, my love, is entirely up to you." Chapter 4. A Warpath of Vengeance. 3 months after the attack on the camp, whispers spread through the borderlands of a lone warrior who hunted the forces of darkness with merciless efficiency. Villages spoke of orcs found slaughtered, their encampments reduced to ash. Undead that had terrorized trade routes suddenly vanished. Goblin raiding parties fled at the mere rumor of his approach. They called him the Wrathful One. Eryon no longer recognized himself in reflections. His once soft features had hardened, his body lean and corded with muscle. A scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, a parting gift from a goblin shaman. His eyes, once brown, now held flecks of electric blue that glowed when he channeled his power. He travelled alone, avoiding the resistance camps, speaking only when necessary. Stormcaller remained his constant companion, though the blade had changed as he had. Its silver edge now bore a faint blue tint, and its runes glowed continuously, responding to the magic that constantly simmered within him. On this night, Eryon crouched on a ridge overlooking an orc encampment in a valley below. 50 or more of the creatures gathered around campfires, feasting on what appeared to be the remains of a merchant caravan they had ambushed. Human captives, 3 men and 2 women, huddled in a crude cage, awaiting a fate Eryon had seen too many times before. In the early days after Calith's death, he would have charged in immediately, heedless of the odds. Now he was more methodical. He studied the camp's layout, noting the sentries, identifying the chieftain's tent, planning his approach. The magic stirred within him, eager for release. It whispered constantly now, urging violence, promising power. Each time he used it, the whispers grew louder, harder to ignore. "They deserve no mercy," the magic insisted. "Burn them all." "Not yet," Eryon muttered. The captives complicated matters. He needed to free them first. He circled the camp, approaching from downwind. The first sentry died silently, Stormcaller sliding between its ribs before it could sound an alarm. The second fell to a thrown dagger. By the time the orcs realized they were under attack, Eryon had already reached the cage. "Stay quiet," he told the captives as he broke the lock with a controlled burst of magic. "Head east. There's a resistance outpost 2 miles from here. Aren't you coming with us? One of the women asked, eyes wide with fear and hope. No, Eryon replied, turning toward the now alert orcs. I have work to finish. As the captives fled, Eryon stepped into the firelight, Stormcaller gleaming in his hand. The orcs growled, reaching for weapons. The wrathful one, hissed the chieftain, a massive creature with tusks adorned with human teeth. Your head will make a fine trophy. Eryon didn't bother responding. He had long since stopped bantering with his prey. Instead, he released a fraction of the power building within him. Lightning crackled along his arms and blade, illuminating the night. The battle was brief and brutal. Orcs fell by the dozen, their crude weapons no match for Eryon's speed and power. Those that fled were struck down by precisely aimed bolts of lightning. Within minutes, only the chieftain remained, backed against a boulder, green blood flowing from multiple wounds. Mercy, it growled, dropping its weapon. 3 months ago, Eryon might have considered it. Now he merely tilted his head, studying the creature dispassionately. Did you show mercy to the caravan you ambushed? He asked. To the captives you plan to eat? The chieftain's silence was answer enough. Stormcaller flashed once, and the creature's head rolled to the ground. Eryon surveyed the carnage with cold satisfaction. Another nest of vermin cleansed from the world, another small victory in his private war. More, the magic whispered. There are always more. He cleaned his blade methodically and began the process of burning the bodies. No sense leaving them to potentially rise as undead. As the flames consumed the orc encampment, Eryon felt the familiar emptiness settle over him. The rush of battle faded, leaving only the hollow ache that had become his constant companion. Victory brought no joy, no peace, only a momentary cessation of pain, quickly replaced by the need to find the next target, to kill again. This was what he had become in the months since Calith's death. Not a hero, a weapon, a force of destruction pointed at the enemies of humanity. The resistance had tried to guide him, to counsel patience and strategy. He had rejected their caution, choosing instead this solitary crusade. Commander Tharok's words echoed in his memory. Vengeance is a poor substitute for purpose, boy. It'll hollow you out until there's nothing left. Perhaps the dwarf was right, but hollowness was preferable to the agony of loss. As long as Eryon kept moving, kept fighting, he could outrun the grief that threatened to consume him. Dawn found him miles from the destroyed orc camp, approaching a small village nestled in a valley. He needed supplies, information about enemy movements, perhaps a day of rest before continuing his hunt. The villagers watched warily as he entered. Word of the wrathful one had spread, and while many welcomed his protection, few wanted him lingering. He was a storm personified, useful against enemies, but dangerous to be near. The tavern fell silent as he entered. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and eyes tracked his movement to the bar. "Ale," he said simply to the nervous innkeeper, "and whatever food you have." "Of course, sir," the man replied, hurrying to comply. "No charge for the wrathful one." Eryon frowned. "I pay my way." He placed coins on the counter, real silver, taken from an orc hoard weeks earlier. The innkeeper seemed relieved, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Grateful for what you did on the North Road," the man said as he placed a tankard before Eryon. "Those undead had been taking travellers for months. Trade's flowing again now." Eryon nodded acknowledgement but didn't engage further. He had learned that people wanted to thank him but didn't actually want to know him. The disconnect between their gratitude and their fear was just another reminder of what he had become. As he ate, he became aware of a presence beside him. A young woman had taken the adjacent civility, watching him with unusual directness. "You don't look like a monster," she said. Eryon raised an eyebrow. "Appearances can be deceiving." "So they say." She pushed a folded piece of parchment toward him. A message, from the Resistance. Eryon's jaw tightened. He had made it clear he wanted no further contact with them. "I'm not interested." "It's from Liara," the woman persisted. "She says it's about the source, about Vorthar." That got his attention. Liara was the Resistance's foremost scholar on the ancient evil, an elven mage who had dedicated centuries to understanding their enemy. Reluctantly, Eryon took the parchment and unfolded it. The message was brief, written in Liara's elegant script. The prison weakens faster than predicted. The final seal will break within the year, not the decade we thought we had. We need you, Eltharion, not your vengeance, your leadership. Come to Highstone Peak at the next full moon if you remember your true purpose. Eryon refolded the parchment, his mind racing. The timeline had accelerated dramatically. If Vorthar broke free completely... "Tell Liara I received her message," he told the messenger. "My aunt's, where will come in my own time." The woman nodded and slipped away, clearly relieved to conclude her business with him. Eryon finished his meal in silence, the weight of the message settling on his shoulders. For months he had focused on the symptoms, the orcs, goblins and undead that served as Vorthar's pawns. But they were merely the vanguard. The true threat remained the dark god himself. Could his one-man war make any difference if Vorthar broke free? Or was he merely delaying the inevitable while indulging his need for revenge? That night, camped in the forest outside the village, Eryon dreamed of Calith for the first time in weeks. Not her death, as he usually did, but a memory from their brief time together in the resistance camp. They sat by a stream, taking a rare moment of rest during his training. Calith had been teaching him about the history of the conflict with Vorthar. "The cycle has repeated for millennia," she explained. "Vorthar rises, Eltharion confronts him, the dark god is imprisoned once more, but each time the prison grows weaker, and each time the cost of victory grows higher." "Why can't he be destroyed permanently?" Eryon had asked. "Because he is part of the balance," Calith replied. "Light and dark, creation and destruction, these forces cannot exist without each other. Destroy one completely and the other collapses as well. So we're fighting a war we can never truly win?" Calith's violet eyes had held his, filled with a wisdom that transcended her youthful appearance. "Perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps we should ask, how do we change the nature of the conflict itself?" Eryon woke with her words echoing in his mind. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading one by one. How do we change the nature of the conflict itself? For months he had been fighting exactly as every previous incarnation of Eltharion had fought. With sword and magic, violence answered with violence. What if that approach was fundamentally flawed? What if it merely perpetuated the cycle rather than breaking it? He rose and began packing his meagre belongings. The next full moon was a week away. Highstone Peak was at least 5 days' journey, even pushing hard. As he doused the remains of his campfire, Eryon made his decision. He would go to Liara, hear what she had discovered. Not because he was ready to rejoin the resistance, but because Calith had believed there was more to his purpose than vengeance. He owed it to her memory to at least consider the possibility that she was right. Chapter 5. The Ghost in the Flames. The village of Ashford had once been home to nearly 300 souls. Now it was a charred husk, its buildings reduced to blackened timbers and ash. Eryon walked through the ruins as dusk approached, cataloguing the destruction with a practiced eye. The attack had come swiftly. No defensive positions had been established, no evidence of prolonged resistance. Most of the villagers had likely been killed in their beds or as they fled. This was the third such village he had found in his journey toward Highstone Peak. The pattern of destruction was expanding, the attacks growing bolder and more frequent. The borderlands were no longer safe, if they ever truly had been. Eryon found a relatively intact structure, the stone foundation of what had once been the village hall, and made camp for the night. As darkness fell, he built a small fire, more for light than warmth in the summer evening. From his pack he produced dried meat and hard bread, a meagre dinner that he consumed mechanically, without pleasure. The silence of the dead village pressed in around him. In the early days of his solitary campaign, he had welcomed such silence, finding in it a respite from the constant whispers of his magic. Now, it merely emphasized his isolation, the distance he had placed between himself and the rest of humanity. As the fire burned low, Eryon found his gaze drawn to the dancing flames. Fire had always fascinated him, even before his awakening as Eltharion. There was something primal about it, both creative and destructive, a force that could sustain life or consume it utterly. The flames shifted, coalescing into patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Eryon blinked, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But no, the fire was definitely moving against the gentle breeze, its shape transforming into something recognizable. A face formed in the heart of the flames, delicate features, almond-shaped eyes, pointed ears partially hidden by flowing hair. Calith! Eryon jerked backward, nearly overturning his pack. "You're not real," he said hoarsely. The fiery apparition tilted its head, regarding him with an expression of profound sadness. "Does that matter?" Calith's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the smoke that curled upward into the night sky. "You're dead," Eryon insisted. "I held you as you died." "Death is not the end you think it is," the apparition replied, "especially for those touched by ancient magic." Eryon's hand moved to Stormcaller's hilt, drawing comfort from its solid presence. "What do you want? Why appear to me now?" The flames shifted, Calith's form becoming more defined, more solid. "Because you stand at a crossroads, Eryon Matthews. The path you have chosen leads only to destruction, not just for your enemies, but for yourself." "My enemies deserve destruction," Eryon replied bitterly. "They showed no mercy to Ashford or to you." "And what has your vengeance accomplished?" Calith's fiery form moved closer, hovering just above the embers. "You've killed hundreds, perhaps thousands, yet the darkness grows stronger. Villages burn, the veil thins, Vorthar's influence spreads." Eryon had no answer for that. It was true. Despite his relentless campaign, the situation had only worsened. The borderlands were collapsing, and reports suggested that incursions into the human world were increasing. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "Rejoin the resistance? Play general in a war we can't win?" "I would have you remember who you truly are," Calith said gently. "Not just Eltharion the warrior, but Eryon the man, the one who showed compassion to children, who fought to protect rather than merely to destroy." "That man died with you," Eryon said, his voice breaking. The fiery apparition reached out, a hand of flame extending toward his face. Eryon felt no heat, only a tingling sensation as it passed near his cheek. "I did not die so you could become a monster in my name," Calith said, her voice hardening. "My sacrifice was meant to awaken your power, yes, but not to unleash it without purpose or control." "Your sacrifice?" Eryon repeated, confusion giving way to anger. "You make it sound planned." The flames flickered, Calith's expression becoming unreadable. "There is much you don't understand about the cycle, about your role in it, about mine." "Then explain it to me," Eryon demanded, rising to his feet. "I'm tired of riddles and half-truths. If you're really Calith and not some trick of my guilty conscience, tell me what I need to know." The fire flared suddenly, illuminating the ruins around them. Calith's form grew, towering over Eryon, her eyes blazing with an inner light that was both beautiful and terrible. "You think your pain is unique?" she asked, her voice resonating with power. "That you alone have suffered loss? Every incarnation of Eltharion has faced this moment, the temptation to abandon humanity and become a force of pure retribution. Some resisted, others embraced the darkness, becoming no better than what they fought." Images flashed in the flames around her, faces similar to Eryon's yet different, men from different eras and backgrounds, all bearing the same burden. Some stood tall, surrounded by allies. Others stood alone, their eyes glowing with the same power that now coursed through Eryon's veins. "The cycle continues because it has never been truly broken," Calith continued, her voice softening. "Vorthar is imprisoned again and again, but never defeated. The Chosen One fights and dies, only to be reborn when the darkness returns." "How do we break it then?" Eryon asked, mesmerized by the visions in the flames. "Not through vengeance," Calith replied. "Not through power alone. The answer lies in what makes this incarnation different from those that came before." "And what's that?" The flames receded, Calith's form diminishing until she was once again a face in the dying fire. "That is for you to discover, Eryon Matthews. I can only point the way. The journey is yours alone." "You're leaving riddles again," Eryon said, frustration evident in his voice. Calith's fiery visage smiled sadly. Some truths cannot be given, only earned. Go to Highstone Peak. Listen to what Liara has discovered. Remember that your greatest strength has never been your magic, but your humanity. The flames flickered, Calith's image beginning to fade. Eryon reached out instinctively, as if he could somehow hold her there. Wait, are you real, or am I just losing my mind? Perhaps both are true, came the fading reply. The boundary between worlds grows thin, dreams and reality blur. Trust your heart, Eryon. It knows the truth even when your mind doubts. With those words, the apparition vanished completely, leaving only normal flames that quickly died to embers in the night air. Eryon sat motionless, staring at the dying fire. Had he truly spoken with Calith's spirit, or had his grief and isolation finally broken his sanity? The magic within him offered no answers, only the same seductive whispers of power and vengeance. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself. If the apparition was real, its warning was clear. His current path led nowhere but deeper into darkness. If it was merely his subconscious speaking through hallucination, the message was the same. Either way, perhaps it was time to reconsider his choices. Eryon opened his pack and withdrew the parchment from Liara. Highstone Peak at the full moon, 3 days from now. He could make it if he pushed hard, travelling through the night. As he repacked his meagre belongings, Eryon's gaze fell on his reflection in a shard of broken glass from the ruined building. The face that looked back at him was barely recognizable. Gaunt, scarred, with eyes that held more blue than brown now. The magic had changed him physically as well as mentally. "Don't lose yourself," Calith had said with her dying breath. Looking at his reflection, Eryon wondered if it was already too late. Dawn found him miles from Ashford, moving steadily eastward toward the mountains where Highstone Peak thrust into the sky. Whether Calith's apparition had been real or imagined, it had accomplished one thing. For the first time in months, Eryon was thinking beyond his next kill, considering a future beyond vengeance. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chapter 6. The Truth About the Chosen One. Highstone Peak lived up to its name, a towering spire of grey stone that dominated the eastern horizon. As Eryon approached, following game trails through increasingly rugged terrain, he noted signs of recent activity. Broken branches, disturbed earth, occasional boot prints. The resistance had passed this way, and recently. The full moon rose as twilight deepened into night, bathing the landscape in silver light. Eryon paused at the base of the peak, studying the sheer rock face before him. To ordinary eyes, it might have appeared unscalable, but he could sense the magic woven into the stone, wards of concealment and protection, subtle enough to escape detection by Vorthar's servants. He placed his palm against the rock, channeling a small amount of his power. "I am Eltharion," he said quietly. "I seek entrance." The stone rippled like water beneath his hand, revealing a narrow passage that had been invisible moments before. Eryon entered cautiously, Stormcaller drawn and ready. The passage closed behind him, plunging him into darkness for a moment before crystals embedded in the walls began to glow with soft blue light. The tunnel wound upward through the heart of the peak, occasionally branching or opening into small chambers. Eryon followed the main path, guided by instinct and the subtle pull of familiar magic ahead. Finally, the passage opened into a large cavern near the summit. Moonlight streamed through a natural skylight in the ceiling, illuminating a space that had been transformed into a combination of library, war room, and living quarters. Maps covered one wall, bookshelves another. A large table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs of various sizes to accommodate the different races of the resistance. Liara stood at the table, examining an ancient tome. She looked up as Eryon entered, her ageless elven features revealing nothing of her thoughts. "You came," she said simply. "I wasn't certain you would." "Neither was I," Eryon admitted, sheathing Stormcaller. He glanced around the cavern. "Where are the others?" "There are no others," Liara replied. "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you alone first." She closed the tome and moved around the table, studying him with eyes that had witnessed centuries of history. Liara was old even by elven standards, her silver hair and delicate features belying the power and knowledge she possessed. "You've changed," she observed. The magic has taken a greater hold than I expected. Is that why you summoned me? To tell me what I already know? Liara shook her head. I summoned you because time grows short, and we need the chosen one. Not the wrathful one you've become, but Eltharion in his fullness. They're the same person, Eryon said flatly. Are they? Liara gestured to a pair of chairs near a small hearth. Sit. There are truths you need to hear. Truths about the cycle, about your role in it, and about Calith. At the mention of Calith, Eryon tensed. What about her? Sit, Liara repeated, more gently this time. Please. Reluctantly, Eryon took one of the offered chairs. Liara sat opposite him, her expression grave. What do you know of the origin of the conflict with Vorthar? She asked. Eryon shrugged. The basics. He's an ancient evil, a dark god who seeks to consume both worlds. Every 1,000 years he attempts to break free from his prison. Eltharion, my previous incarnations, have fought him each time, renewing the prison but never destroying him completely. A simplified version but essentially correct, Liara acknowledged. What you don't know is how the cycle began, or why you, specifically you, Eryon Matthews, were chosen for this incarnation. She rose and retrieved a crystal decanter from a nearby shelf, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. Elven brandy, she explained, offering one to Eryon. You may want this for what comes next. Eryon accepted the glass but didn't drink. I'm listening. Liara took a sip of her brandy, then set the glass aside. In the beginning there were 2 gods, Eltharion the creator and Vorthar the destroyer. Not good and evil as mortals understand those concepts, but necessary opposites, like day and night. They maintained the balance of existence, each fulfilling their role in the cosmic order. Wait, Eryon interrupted. Eltharion was a god? The original Eltharion, yes, Liara confirmed. For eons the 2 gods maintained their balance, but over time Vorthar grew resentful. Creation flourished while destruction was feared and shunned. He began to desire not just his rightful domain, but dominion over all existence. She paused, her gaze distant, as if seeing across millennia. War erupted between them, a conflict so vast it threatened to unmake reality itself. Realizing that neither could destroy the other without unraveling the fabric of existence, Eltharion made a desperate choice. He fragmented his divine essence, embedding the largest portion in a prison that would contain Vorthar, using his own power to counterbalance the dark gods. And the rest of his essence? Eryon asked, beginning to understand. Distributed among mortal bloodlines, Liara said softly. A spark of divinity passed down through generations, awakening fully when Vorthar's prison weakens. That spark is what makes you the chosen one, Eryon. You carry within you a fragment of the original god, Eltharion. Eryon sat back, stunned by the revelation. It explained so much. The power that seemed to have a will of its own, the memories of past lives, the sense that he was both himself and someone else simultaneously. So I'm not just the reincarnation of a hero, he said slowly. I'm literally carrying a piece of a god inside me. Yes, Liara confirmed. Though carrying isn't quite right. The divine spark has merged with your soul. You are both Eryon Matthews and Eltharion, neither one complete without the other. And Calith? Eryon asked, remembering the apparition in the flames. Where does she fit into this? Liara's expression softened with something like compassion. That is perhaps the hardest truth of all. Calith is not merely an elven warrior who happened to find you. She is a constant in the cycle, a guide, a catalyst, and ultimately a sacrifice. What do you mean, a sacrifice? Eryon demanded, his grip tightening on the untouched glass of brandy. The divine spark within you requires a specific trigger to awaken fully, Liara explained gently. A profound loss. A moment of emotional cataclysm that breaks down the barriers between your mortal consciousness and the divine power within. In every cycle, that trigger has been the same, the death of someone deeply connected to the chosen one. The glass shattered in Eryon's hand, brandy and blood mingling as shards cut into his palm. He barely noticed the pain. You're saying her death was planned? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. That she died just to awaken my power? Not planned by us, Liara clarified quickly. The pattern is woven into the cycle itself. Calith is drawn to each incarnation of Eltharion, forms a bond, and inevitably becomes the catalyst for the awakening. It is her purpose, her burden across countless lifetimes. That's monstrous, Eryon said, rising from his chair. You're telling me that every 1,000 years she's born just to die, that her only purpose is to trigger my transformation? It's more complex than that, Liara insisted. Calith is not merely a victim of the cycle. In many ways she is its guardian. Her spirit remembers what her mortal incarnations do not. The full history of the conflict, the nature of both Eltharion and Vorthar. She guides, she teaches, and yes, ultimately, she sacrifices. Eryon paced the cavern, trying to process the revelation. The woman who appeared to me in Oakridge, the one who brought me to the resistance camp, she said she was Calith from the future. And so she was, Liara confirmed. As the cycle progresses, the boundaries between time and space grow thin. Calith's spirit can sometimes move between points in the timeline, especially at crucial junctures. And the apparition I saw in the fire at Ashford, was that real too? Liara nodded. Her connection to you transcends physical death. She remains bound to you, to the divine spark you carry. In previous cycles, this connection has manifested in different ways. Dreams, visions, sometimes even physical manifestations in moments of great need. Eryon stopped pacing, turning to face the elven mage. Why tell me this now? What does it change? Everything, Liara said simply. This cycle is different, Eryon. The pattern is breaking down. Vorthar's prison weakens faster than ever before, and the boundaries between worlds grow dangerously thin. The old approach, fighting, imprisoning, repeating the cycle, may no longer be sufficient. What's the alternative? Liara rose, moving to the table where the ancient tomes still lay open. That's what I've been researching. There may be a way to end the cycle permanently, to reforge the balance that was broken eons ago. But it would require something no previous incarnation of Eltharion has been willing to attempt. Which is reintegration, Liara said, her finger tracing a diagram in the tome. Not just fighting Vorthar, but reclaiming your full divine nature, and then using that power to heal the rift between creation and destruction, to make whole what was sundered. Eryon approached the table, studying the diagram, a complex arrangement of symbols surrounding two intertwined figures, one light, one dark. And how exactly would I reclaim my full divine nature? He asked skeptically. By gathering the other fragments, Liara explained. The divine spark you carry is the largest piece, but not the only one. Others exist, hidden throughout both worlds, guarded by those who understand their significance. Like what? Divine artifacts? Sacred places? Some, yes. Others are less tangible. Concepts, emotions, states of being that embody aspects of the original Eltharion. Compassion, wisdom, sacrifice, justice. By embracing these fully, by integrating them into your being, you draw the fragments back together. Eryon shook his head, overwhelmed by the scope of what Liara suggested. This sounds like mystical nonsense. You're asking me to become a god. I'm asking you to become who you truly are, Liara corrected. The divine spark has always been part of you, Eryon. The question is whether you will allow it to consume you, as it has begun to do, or whether you will master it, integrate it, and use it for its intended purpose. And what about Calith? Eryon asked, his voice softening. If I succeed, what happens to her? Is she freed from the cycle, or is she bound to it eternally? Liara's expression grew troubled. That I don't know. The texts are unclear on her ultimate fate. Some suggest she is an aspect of Eltharion himself, a personification of his capacity for love and sacrifice. Others imply she is a separate entity entirely, bound to the cycle by choice rather than necessity. She deserves better than endless sacrifice, Eryon said firmly. If I do this, if I try to end the cycle, it has to free her too. Otherwise, what's the point? A small smile touched Liara's lips. And that, Eryon Matthews, is why you were chosen for this incarnation. Your compassion, your sense of justice, these qualities make you uniquely suited for what must be done. I've spent months killing without mercy, Eryon reminded her bitterly. Compassion isn't exactly my defining trait these days. Yet here you stand, concerned for Calith's fate even after learning the truth about her role, Liara pointed out. The wrathful one is what you became in grief and rage. It is not who you are at your core. Before Eryon could respond, a chime sounded. From somewhere in the cavern, Liara moved to a crystal embedded in the wall, placing her hand upon it. The crystal glowed briefly, then projected an image into the air, Commander Tharok's grizzled face. "Liara," the dwarf said urgently, "we've got trouble. Big trouble. The eastern outpost has fallen. The boundary there has collapsed completely. Vorthar's forces pour through by the thousands." "Casualties?" Liara asked, her voice steady despite the dire news. "Total," Tharok replied grimly. "No survivors. We're falling back to the secondary positions, but without reinforcements we won't hold for long. What of the western boundary?" "Holding barely. But if the east is any indication, not for much longer." Tharok's eyes shifted, noticing Eryon for the first time. "Well, well, the prodigal son returns. Decided to rejoin the living, have you?" "Something like that," Eryon replied neutrally. Tharok grunted. "Good timing. We need every sword we can get, especially ones that can call lightning." "We'll come to you," Liara decided. "Highstone is no longer safe if the eastern boundary has fallen. The mountain passes will be overrun within days." "Make it quick," Tharok advised. "We're setting up at Iron Deep. You know the way." The projection faded, leaving Liara and Eryon in silence for a moment. "It's happening faster than I feared," Liara said finally. "The collapse of the eastern boundary means Vorthar's influence now extends directly into your world. Cities, nations, none will be spared if we cannot contain this. Then we don't have time for mystical quests to gather divine fragments," Eryon said pragmatically. "We need to fight, to hold the line while we figure out a more permanent solution." Liara studied him thoughtfully. "Perhaps the two are not mutually exclusive. The fragments I spoke of, they aren't just abstract concepts. Some are embodied in physical objects in places of power. We may be able to recover them even as we fight to contain the immediate threat." She moved to a chest in the corner of the cavern, withdrawing a small wooden box. From it, she removed a pendant, a simple silver disc etched with the same runes that adorned Stormcaller. "This is one such fragment," she explained, offering it to Eryon. "It has been in my keeping for centuries, awaiting the right moment, the right incarnation." Eryon accepted the pendant cautiously. As his fingers closed around it, warmth spread up his arm. The runes glowed briefly, resonating with the magic within him. For a moment, the constant whispers of power quieted, replaced by a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced since before Calith's death. "What is it?" he asked, slipping the chain over his head. "A focus," Liara replied. "A ability to help you control and direct the divine spark rather than being controlled by it. It won't solve everything, but it's a start." Eryon touched the pendant, feeling its subtle influence on his magic. "Thank you." Liara nodded, then began gathering essential items from around the cavern: books, scrolls, crystals of various sizes and colours. "We should leave within the hour. The journey to Iron Deep will take 2 days if we push hard." As she packed, Eryon moved to the cavern's entrance, looking out at the moonlit landscape below. Somewhere out there, the boundary between worlds was collapsing. Vorthar's forces were pouring through, bringing death and destruction to both realms. The pendant rested against his chest, a small weight that somehow lightened the burden he had carried for months. The truth about his nature, about Calith, about the cycle itself. It was overwhelming, yet strangely liberating. For the first time since that night in the resistance camp, he felt a sense of purpose beyond vengeance. Whether he was man or god or something in between, one thing was certain. The time for solitary hunting was over. The real war had begun, and he would need allies to face what was coming. "Ready?" Liara asked, approaching with a packed satchel. Eryon nodded, his hand moving to Stormcaller's hilt. "Ready." Together, they stepped into the passage that would take them down the mountain and toward whatever fate awaited at Iron Deep. The wrathful one was still part of him. The rage and power still simmered beneath the surface. But now, perhaps, there was something more as well. A glimmer of the hero he was meant to be, the god he had once been. Only time would tell which would prevail. Chapter 7. The Gathering of the Lost. The journey to Iron Deep took them through increasingly dangerous territory. What had once been peaceful farmland was now blighted, crops withered in the fields, abandoned homesteads standing like skeletons against the horizon. Twice they were forced to hide as patrols of orcs and goblins passed nearby, and once they fought their way through a small band of undead that blocked their path. Eryon noted with grim satisfaction that his power seemed more controlled with Liara's pendant around his neck. The magic still responded to his call, but the whispers had diminished, and the constant temptation to unleash destruction had receded to a manageable level. As they crested a hill on the morning of the second day, Liara pointed to a range of low mountains ahead. Iron Deep lies within the largest peak, she explained. The dwarves have maintained it as a fallback position for centuries, though it hasn't been needed until now. How many fighters does Tharok have? Eryon asked, assessing the tactical situation with newfound clarity. Perhaps 200, drawn from various outposts and camps, Liara replied. Not enough for a direct confrontation with Vorthar's forces, but enough to conduct guerrilla operations while we search for a more permanent solution. They descended into a valley that showed signs of recent battle. Scorched earth, broken weapons, bodies of both defenders and attackers left where they had fallen. Eryon paused beside the corpse of a human fighter, a young woman whose face still held the shadow of determination even in death. I knew her, he said quietly. Mira. She was training as a healer when I left the camp. Liara placed a hand on his shoulder. Many have fallen, Eryon. Many more will fall before this is over. We honor them best by ensuring their sacrifice wasn't in vain. They continued in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the mountains, Eryon became aware of eyes watching them, sentries hidden among the rocks, bows trained on potential threats. He raised his hands slowly, allowing Stormcaller to be visible at his hip. Eltharion returns, he called out, using the formal greeting he had learned during his time with the Resistance. A moment passed, then a figure emerged from behind a boulder, a dwarf woman with a crossbow and an impressive beard braided with iron beads. Password? She demanded gruffly. Silverlight endures, Liara replied. The dwarf lowered her weapon and gestured for them to follow. Commander's been expecting you. Things have gotten worse since his message. She led them to what appeared to be a solid rock face. Placing her palm against the stone, she muttered words in the ancient dwarven tongue. The rock shimmered and parted, revealing a wide tunnel lit by glowing crystals similar to those in Highstone Peak. Inside, Iron Deep was a marvel of dwarven engineering, a vast complex of chambers and tunnels carved directly into the mountain. Unlike the crude minds of human imagination, these spaces were works of art, with soaring ceilings supported by intricately carved pillars and walls inlaid with precious metals that caught and reflected the light of the crystals. But the beauty was marred by the signs of desperate preparation for war. Barricades had been erected at key junctions, weapons stockpiled in side chambers, and the great hall at the heart of the complex had been converted into a combination infirmary and command center. Commander Tharok stood at a large table in the center of the hall, surrounded by maps and reports. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face showing momentary relief before returning to its customary scowl. About time, he grunted, situations deteriorating by the hour. We came as quickly as we could, Liara replied, setting her satchel on the table. What's the latest? Tharok gestured to the maps. Eastern boundary's completely gone, southern boundary's failing. We've got reports of orc warbands as far west as the human cities of Eastridge and Northaven. The veil is thinning everywhere. More humans are seeing through it, causing panic and confusion. And the northern boundary? Eryon asked, studying the maps. Holding for now, Tharok replied. The elven enclaves there maintain powerful wards, but they're isolated, cut off from reinforcement. Eryon traced the line of the eastern boundary, or where it had been. How many forces does Vorthar have coming through? Thousands, Tharok said grimly. Maybe tens of thousands. And that's just the advance guard. If the prison breaks completely... He didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone present knew what total failure would mean. Vorthar himself emerging into the world, bringing an apocalypse that would consume both realms. We need more fighters, Eryon said. his tactical mind assessing their dire situation. 200 won't be enough, even for guerrilla operations. Tell me something I don't know, Tharok retorted. But most of our outposts are overrun or cut off. The human governments are still in denial, treating this as a series of terrorist attacks or natural disasters, and the Elven High Council is focused on protecting their own territories. What about the exiled dwarven clans? Liara suggested. The Ironbeards, the Stonefists? Tharok's expression darkened. They want nothing to do with surface problems. Old grudges run deep. I might be able to change their minds, came a new voice from the entrance to the hall. All heads turned to see a dwarf unlike any Eryon had encountered before. Taller than most of his kind, with a beard of deep auburn braided with gold, he wore armor of a design Eryon didn't recognize and carried a warhammer that seemed to hum with contained power. Durnak Ironbeard, the newcomer introduced himself with a formal bow. Former king of the Eastern Deeps currently, between thrones. Tharok's scowl deepened. What are you doing here, Ironbeard? Last I heard you were exiled for treason. False accusations, Durnak replied easily, approaching the table. But that's a story for another time. I bring 40 fighters, all veterans of the Goblin Wars, and information about Vorthar's movements that you'll find valuable. Why would you help us? Tharok demanded suspiciously. Durnak's casual demeanor slipped, revealing something harder beneath. Because unlike my short-sighted kin, I understand that if Vorthar wins, there will be no safe depths to hide in. The darkness will consume everything above ground and below. He turned to Eryon, studying him with keen eyes. So you're the current Eltharion, younger than the last one. Let's hope you're luckier. Before Eryon could respond, another newcomer entered the hall, a slender figure in a hooded cloak that seemed to shift colors in the crystal light. Luck has little to do with it, the figure said, pushing back her hood to reveal distinctly elven features, though with an unusual violet tint to her skin. Skill, power, and proper guidance are what matter. Liara, Tharok acknowledged with a nod that held more respect than he had shown Durnak. I didn't expect to see you here. The situation warranted personal attention, she replied, her gaze moving between the maps and Eryon. I bring word from the southern enclaves. The boundary there will fail within days without intervention. Eryon realized this was a different Liara than the one who had accompanied him from Highstone Peak. Another instance of the time distortions Liara had mentioned. The elven mage he had travelled with now stood at his side, seemingly unsurprised by her duplicate's appearance. The timelines converge, his Liara murmured, a sign of how close we are to total collapse. The violet-skinned Liara approached Eryon, studying him with unnerving intensity. You've given him the pendant, she observed to her counterpart. Good. Has he accepted the truth? He knows his nature, the first Liara confirmed, and Calith's role. But does he understand what must be done? The newcomer pressed. Before either could answer, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. A human in tattered clothing staggered in, supported by 2 elven scouts. Blood stained his side and his face was pale with exhaustion and pain. Rin! Tharok exclaimed, moving to help the wounded man to a bench. What happened? Where's your team? Dead, the man gasped, wincing as he was lowered to the seat. All dead. Ambush at Widow's Pass. Not just orcs, something else, something worse. A healer hurried forward, examining the wound in Rin's side. Poisoned, she announced. Black venom. We need to treat this immediately. As the healer worked, Rin's feverish gaze found Eryon. You, he said, recognition dawning. The wrathful one. They speak of you, you know. The orcs. They fear you. Rest now, Tharok advised, but Rin shook his head weakly. No time for rest. They're coming. A force larger than any we've seen, led by one of Vorthar's lieutenants. They know about Iron Deep. They'll be here by nightfall. Alarm spread through the hall. Tharok immediately began issuing orders, sending runners to prepare defences and position fighters. The 2 Liaras conferred in rapid Elvish, while Durnak examined the maps, identifying potential choke points and fallback positions. Eryon stood silent, absorbing the implications. Iron Deep was supposed to be a secret, a safe haven unknown to Vorthar's forces. If they had discovered it, there was likely a traitor somewhere in the resistance, or their intelligence capabilities far exceeded previous estimates. "How many?" he asked Rin directly. The wounded scout grimaced as the healer applied a poultice to his side. "Thousands, maybe 5,000. Orcs, goblins, undead, and something else. Shadows that move independently, taking forms from nightmare." "Void walkers," the violet-skinned Liara said grimly. "Vorthar's elite. They can pass through solid matter, possess the weak-minded, and drain life with a touch." "Can they be killed?" Eryon asked practically. "With difficulty," she replied. "Magic affects them, particularly light-based spells, and your Stormcaller should prove effective given its nature." Tharok rejoined them, his expression grim but determined. "We've got maybe 6 hours before they reach us. Not enough time to evacuate everyone, especially the wounded." "Then we fight," Dernak said simply, hefting his warhammer. "My warriors will hold the main approach. We've faced worse odds." "Have you?" Rin asked skeptically, his voice weak but sardonic. "Because I've been fighting Vorthar's forces for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what's coming." "Bickering won't improve our chances," the first Liara interjected. "We need a plan that maximizes our limited resources." All eyes turned to Eryon. Despite his months of solitary hunting, they still looked to him as Altharian, the leader who had guided them through countless battles across the cycles. The pendant at his chest seemed to warm slightly, and with it came a clarity of thought that surprised him. Tactical assessments, strategic options, and battlefield memories, both his own recent experiences and older ones from past incarnations, flowed together into a coherent whole. "We don't try to hold the entire complex," he decided, moving to the map of Iron Deep. "We funnel them through the narrowest approaches, set traps in the secondary tunnels, and prepare a fallback position here, in the Great Forge." His finger indicated a massive chamber deep within the mountain, accessible only by 2 narrow passages. "The forge has its own water supply and enough provisions to last weeks," he continued. "We evacuate non-combatants there now, along with our most seriously wounded. The rest of us fight a controlled retreat, bleeding them at every turn." Tharok nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in the plan. "The eastern passage to the forge has a section that can be collapsed if necessary. We could trap a significant portion of their force there. And the western passage can be defended by a small number of skilled fighters," Dernak added. "My people know these kinds of battles. We'll hold it." "What about the Void Walkers?" Rin asked. "They can pass through stone. Collapsing tunnels won't stop them." "That's where we come in," the violet-skinned Liara said, indicating herself and her counterpart. "We can establish wards that will repel them, at least temporarily." "And I'll handle any that get through," Eryon added, his hand moving to Stormcaller's hilt. The plan quickly took shape. Dernak's dwarves would defend the western approach to the forge, while Tharok's fighters would conduct the fighting retreat through the eastern tunnels, collapsing them at strategic points. The 2 Liaras would establish magical defenses against the Void Walkers, and Eryon would serve as a mobile reserve, reinforcing whichever position faced the greatest pressure. As the others dispersed to their assigned tasks, Rin caught Eryon's arm. Despite his wound, the scout's grip was surprisingly strong. "I've heard stories about you," Rin said, his voice low. "The wrathful one, cutting a swath through Vorthar's forces. Some say you're a hero. Others call you a monster nearly as bad as what we're fighting." "And what do you say?" Eryon asked, curious despite himself. A ghost of a smile touched Rin's pale lips. "I say we need both the hero and the monster if we're going to survive this. Just make sure you know which is which when this is over." Before Eryon could respond, the healer returned, insisting that Rin needed rest. As the scout was helped toward the evacuation area, Eryon found himself pondering the man's words. The hero and the monster. Perhaps they weren't as separate as he had believed. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Eryon moved throughout the complex, helping position fighters, reviewing defensive plans, and offering encouragement where needed. The pendant continued to provide clarity, helping him balance the tactical demands of the moment with the strategic necessities of their situation. As the deadline approached, he found himself in a small chamber near the main entrance, making final adjustments to his armor. a lightweight combination of leather and metal plates that offered protection without sacrificing mobility. The two Liaras entered, their preparations for the magical defences apparently complete. "A moment, if you will," the violet-skinned Liara requested. Eryon nodded, curious about what they wanted. "We've been discussing your role in what's to come," his Liara began, "both in this battle and in the larger conflict." "And?" Eryon prompted when she hesitated. "The pendant I gave you is only the first step," she explained. "To truly master the divine spark within you, to have any hope of ending the cycle, you'll need to gather more fragments." "This isn't exactly the best time for a scavenger hunt," Eryon pointed out. The violet-skinned Liara smiled thinly. "On the contrary, the collapse of the boundaries has made certain fragments more accessible than they've been in millennia. One such fragment is currently in the possession of Vorthar's lieutenant, the one leading the force against us." That got Eryon's attention. "What kind of fragment?" "A crystal known as the Heart of Storms," she replied. "It contains a portion of Altharian's power over the elements, a power you've already demonstrated some ability with. If you could claim it," the first Liara added, "it would significantly increase your control and the range of your abilities." Eryon considered this new information. "So while we're fighting for our lives, you want me to hunt down this lieutenant and take this crystal?" "We want you to be aware of the opportunity," the violet-skinned Liara clarified. "The battle must come first, of course, but if the chance presents itself—" A horn sounded from the outer defences, 3 short blasts followed by 1 long one. The enemy had been sighted. "No more time for discussion," Eryon said, drawing Stormcaller. The blade hummed in his hand, eager for what was to come. "We each know our roles. Let's make sure we're alive to continue this conversation after the battle." The Liaras nodded in unison, a sight Eryon still found disconcerting. As they left to take up their positions, he made his way to the main entrance where Tharok and a group of fighters waited, weapons ready. "They're coming up the main approach," the dwarf commander reported. "Thousands of them, just as Rin said. Orcs in the vanguard, undead behind them, with what look like the Void Walkers commanding from the rear." "And the lieutenant?" Eryon asked, thinking of the Heart of Storms. Tharok shook his head. "Not visible yet. Probably waiting until the initial assault softens us up." Eryon nodded, then addressed the assembled fighters. "Many of you know me only by reputation, as Eltharion, or as the Wrathful One. Today, I fight simply as one of you, defending what matters against the darkness that would consume it. We are outnumbered, yes, but not outmatched. Every one of you is worth 10 of them in skill and courage." He raised Stormcaller, the blade catching the light of the crystals overhead. "We fight not just for ourselves, but for both worlds. For everyone who cannot see the threat yet, who doesn't understand what's at stake. Hold fast to that purpose, and we will prevail." A cheer went up from the fighters, their faces showing new determination. Eryon hadn't planned the speech, but the words had come naturally, as if some part of him remembered giving similar encouragement in battles long past. "Not bad," Tharok muttered as the fighters took their positions. The last Eltharion wasn't much for speeches, preferred to let his sword do the talking. "Different incarnation, different approach," Eryon replied with a slight smile. The smile faded as the first wave of orcs came into view at the far end of the approach tunnel. They charged forward with surprising discipline, shields locked together, crude but effective armor protecting vital areas. "Here we go," Tharok growled, readying his warhammer. "Remember the plan. Controlled retreat after the initial engagement. No heroics." Eryon nodded, though the magic within him surged in anticipation of battle. The pendant helped control it, but he could still feel the power building, eager for release. The orcs hit their first line of defences, caltrops scattered across the tunnel floor, followed by pits concealed with thin coverings of stone. Their charge faltered as the front ranks fell, but those behind simply climbed over their fallen comrades and continued forward. "Archers!" Tharok commanded. A volley of arrows flew from positions on elevated platforms, cutting down dozens or orcs. But still they came, their numbers seemingly endless. "Hold until they reach the second marker," Tharok instructed his fighters. "Then fall back to position 2. Eryon watched the approaching horde, calculating distances and timing. The second marker was a subtle line etched into the floor about 30 yards ahead. When the orcs crossed it, "Now!" Tharok shouted. The fighters began their planned withdrawal, moving with practiced efficiency toward the next defensive position. As the last of them cleared the area, Eryon stepped forward, Stormcaller raised. "Cover your eyes," he warned Tharok. The dwarf commander barely had time to comply before Eryon channeled his power through the blade. Lightning erupted from the sword, arcing across the tunnel in a blinding display. Where it struck, orcs convulsed and fell, their crude armor offering no protection against the magical onslaught. For a moment, the advance halted as the survivors hesitated, suddenly wary of the lone figure before them. Eryon used the opportunity to fall back to the next position, joining Tharok and his fighters. "Impressive," the dwarf acknowledged, "but pace yourself. This is just the beginning." He was right. As the battle progressed, the defenders were pushed back steadily through the tunnels of Iron Deep. They fought with skill and courage, making the enemy pay dearly for every yard gained, but the sheer numbers of Vorthar's forces told over time. Eryon moved between defensive positions, using his power where it would be most effective, bolstering faltering lines and covering retreats. The pendant helped him maintain control, preventing the magic from consuming him as it had in previous battles. 3 hours into the fighting, they had fallen back to the final approaches to the Great Forge. Durnak and his dwarves held the western passage with grim determination, while Tharok's remaining fighters defended the eastern route. Casualties had been heavy on both sides, but the defenders had inflicted far more damage than they had suffered. Eryon found himself at Tharok's position, helping repel a particularly fierce assault led by undead warriors more skilled than the mindless shamblers they had faced earlier. These undead retained their combat abilities from life, making them far more dangerous opponents. As they fought, a chill swept through the tunnel, so intense that frost formed on the stone walls. The undead fell back, creating a space at the center of the passage. Into that space stepped a figure that could only be Vorthar's lieutenant. Tall and gaunt, with skin like polished obsidian, the creature wore armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its eyes glowed with the same blue fire as the undead it commanded, but with an intelligence and malice that marked it as something far more dangerous. Around its neck hung a crystal that pulsed with inner lightning, the heart of storms. "Altharion," the lieutenant said, its voice like ice cracking. "My master sends his regards. He has waited long for your return." "Your master will have to keep waiting," Eryon replied, stepping forward to meet this new threat. "I have no intention of joining him anytime soon." The lieutenant laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Join him? No, little godling. He intends to consume you, to absorb the divine spark you carry and use its power to break free completely." It drew a sword of black metal that seemed to drink in the light around it. "I am Morthax, Void General, first servant of Vorthar. Surrender now, and your friends will be granted quick deaths. Resist, and they will suffer beyond imagining before the end." Eryon's response was to charge, Stormcaller meeting the black blade in a shower of sparks. The impact sent a jolt up his arm. Morthax was incredibly strong, its movements inhumanly fast. They exchanged a flurry of blows, testing each other's defenses. Eryon found himself drawing on combat memories from past incarnations, movements and techniques he had never learned in this life flowing naturally through his body. "Impressive," Morthax acknowledged as they separated after the initial exchange. "You remember more than the last one did at this stage, but memory alone won't save you." The lieutenant gestured, and shadows peeled away from the walls, forming into the Void Walkers Liara had warned about. They moved toward Tharok and his fighters, who backed away warily. "Your choice, Altharion," Morthax said with cruel amusement. "Face me alone, or watch your friends die while you try to save them." It was no choice at all. Eryon knew he couldn't defeat both Morthax and the Void Walkers simultaneously, but perhaps he didn't have to. "Tharok," he called without taking his eyes off Morthax. "Fall back to the forge. Collapse the tunnel." "And leave you?" the dwarf demanded incredulously. "I'll find another way out," Eryon promised. "Go, now." After a moment's hesitation, Tharok gave the order. His fighters began withdrawing toward the forge entrance, maintaining a defensive formation against the approaching Voidwalkers. Morthax laughed again. Noble sacrifice? How predictable. Your kind always chooses the path of martyrdom. Not sacrifice, Eryon corrected, feeling the magic building within him. Tactical necessity. He lunged forward suddenly, not at Morthax but past him, slashing at the support beams that held up this section of tunnel. Stormcaller's enchanted edge cut through the reinforced wood like paper. Morthax realized his intention too late. No! The ceiling began to crack as the supports failed. Eryon continued his charge, heading not toward the forge but back the way they had come, toward a side passage he had noted earlier. Behind him, he heard Morthax's howl of rage, followed by the rumble of collapsing stone. The tunnel was coming down, separating him from both Tharok's fighters and the Voidwalkers, but also potentially cutting off his escape route. Eryon dove for the side passage just as the main tunnel collapsed completely. Dust and debris filled the air, choking him as he rolled to his feet and continued running. This smaller passage wasn't on the main maps of Iron Deep. He had no idea where it led, only that it went away from the collapse. After several minutes of navigating increasingly narrow tunnels, he emerged into a natural cavern lit dimly by phosphorescent fungi. Water dripped from stalactites overhead, forming small pools on the uneven floor. Eryon paused to catch his breath and assess his situation. He was separated from his allies in an unmapped section of the mountain with no clear path back to the forge, and somewhere behind him, possibly buried under tons of rock but more likely pursuing through other routes, was Morthax, a foe beyond any he had faced in this incarnation. But he was alive, and he had bought time for Tharok and the others to reach the relative safety of the forge. Now he needed to find his own way to safety, or at least to a position where he could continue to fight effectively. The pendant at his chest pulsed gently, as if responding to his thoughts. With it came a sense of direction, a subtle pull toward something. Eryon couldn't identify what it was drawing him toward, but in the absence of better options, he decided to follow it. The cavern connected to a series of natural tunnels that wound deeper into the mountain. Eryon moved cautiously, alert for signs of enemies or cave-ins. The pull of the pendant grew stronger as he progressed, leading him ever downward. After what felt like hours of careful navigation, the tunnel opened into another cavern, this one vast and illuminated by a soft blue glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. At the center stood a pool of water so still it resembled glass, reflecting the crystalline formations that hung from the ceiling. And beside the pool, waiting as if she had known he would come, stood Calith. Not the Calith who had died in his arms, nor the future version who had brought him to the Resistance. This was yet another incarnation, dressed in simple white robes, her silver hair unbound and flowing to her waist. "You found your way," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Good, we don't have much time." "Who are you?" Eryon asked, though he already knew the answer in some fundamental way. "Which Calith?" She smiled sadly. "All of them. None of them. I am what remains when the cycle turns, what persists between incarnations. Some call me the guardian of the veil, others the memory of light. Why are you here? How are you here?" "This place exists between worlds, between times," she explained, gesturing to the cavern around them. "A nexus point where the boundaries grow thin. As for why..." She approached him, her movements fluid and graceful. "You face Morthax, one of Vorthar's most dangerous servants. You seek the heart of storms. Both goals align with my purpose, which is to guide you as always, to help you remember what you truly are." She reached out, her fingers brushing the pendant at his chest. "This fragment helps control your power, but control alone is not enough. You need understanding." Before Eryon could respond, a cold wind swept through the cavern, rippling the surface of the previously still pool. Calith's expression hardened. "He comes," she said urgently. "Morthax has found the nexus. You must be ready." "Ready how?" Eryon demanded. "I couldn't defeat him above. What's changed?" Calith, too, his face in her hands, her touch cool but not unpleasant. Everything has changed. You stand in a place of power, a place where your divine nature resonates more strongly, and you have me. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead. A surge of energy flowed through the contact, memories flooding his mind, not just of this life or even recent incarnations, but older, deeper memories. He saw himself as he had been eons ago, before the fragmentation, when he had been Eltharion the creator in his fullness. The memories brought pain but also clarity. Understanding bloomed within him, not just of what he had been, but of what he could be again. "Remember," Calith whispered, stepping back, "and when the moment comes, trust not just in power but in purpose." The wind intensified, and the surface of the pool began to boil. From its depths rose Vorthar, his obsidian armor gleaming wetly, his eyes blazing with fury. "The Guardian!" he snarled upon seeing Calith. "Always interfering, always prolonging the inevitable." "There is nothing inevitable about tyranny, Vorthar," she replied calmly. "Or about your master's ambitions." The Void General laughed harshly. "Says the eternal sacrifice. How many times have you died for him, Guardian? How many more times will you suffer before you accept the futility of resistance?" "As many as necessary," Calith said simply. She turned to Eryon. "Remember what I showed you. The power is yours by right, but only if claimed for the right purpose." With those words, she stepped back, fading into the blue light of the cavern until she was gone from sight, though Eryon could still feel her presence somehow. Vorthar drew his black blade, the heart of storms pulsing at his throat. "Alone again, godling. No friends to die for you this time. No guardian to save you." Eryon raised Stormcaller, the runes along its length glowing in response to the nexus energy around them. "I don't need saving," he said with newfound confidence, "and I'm never truly alone." The battle that followed was like nothing Eryon had experienced before. Vorthar attacked with inhuman speed and strength, his blade leaving trails of darkness in the air. But Eryon met him blow for blow, the memories Calith had awakened guiding his movements. Lightning crackled around Stormcaller, meeting the void energy that emanated from Vorthar's weapon. Each impact sent shockwaves through the cavern, disturbing the crystalline formations overhead. "You've improved," Vorthar acknowledged as they circled each other after an intense exchange. "But you're still holding back, still afraid of your own nature." "Not afraid," Eryon corrected, "respectful of its purpose." "Purpose?" Vorthar sneered. "Power has no purpose beyond domination. That's what Vorthar understood, and your original self never did. Power exists to be used, to shape reality according to one's will." "Power exists to create, to nurture, to protect," Eryon countered. "Domination is the weakest use of power, not the strongest." Vorthar's response was another furious assault. This time he supplemented his physical attacks with void magic, sending tendrils of darkness to ensnare Eryon's limbs and sap his strength. Eryon countered with his own magic, lightning severing the tendrils before they could take hold. But he could feel himself tiring. Despite the Nexus energy and Calith's gift of memories, he was still primarily mortal, facing an opponent who knew no fatigue. "Trust not just in power, but in purpose," Calith had said. As Vorthar pressed his attack, Eryon found himself backing toward the pool at the center of the cavern. An idea formed, dangerous, potentially suicidal, but possibly their only hope. He allowed Vorthar to drive him back step by step, making it appear that he was weakening. The Void General grew more confident, his attacks becoming slightly less cautious. "You fade, godling," Vorthar taunted. "The divine spark gutters. Soon it will be ours, and Vorthar will break free at last." "If you want it," Eryon replied, taking another step back. "Come and take it." Vorthar lunged forward with a triumphant snarl, directly into Eryon's trap. At the last possible moment, Eryon sidestepped and seized the chain that held the Heart of Storms. With a sharp twist, he snapped it free from Vorthar's neck. The Void General howled in rage, his blade slashing wildly. The edge caught Eryon across the chest, cutting through his armor and into flesh beneath. Pain flared, but Eryon maintained his grip on the crystal. Staggering backward, he fell into the pool, the heart of storms clutched tightly in his fist. The moment the crystal touched the Nexus water, energy exploded outward. Lightning arced from the pool to the ceiling, from wall to wall, filling the cavern with blinding light. Vorthar screamed, the sound more felt than heard as the energy engulfed him. His obsidian form began to crack, light pouring from the fissures in his armor. Eryon felt the heart of storms dissolving in his grasp, its power flowing into him, merging with the divine spark he already carried. With it came another flood of memories and abilities, control over storms, winds, the very elements themselves. The Nexus water swirled around him, healing his wound even as it conducted the massive energies being released. Eryon rose to his feet, standing in the center of the pool as lightning continued to fill the cavern. Vorthar fell to his knees, his form disintegrating under the onslaught of pure creation energy. "This changes nothing," he gasped. "Vorthar comes!" "Then I'll be waiting," Eryon replied, raising Stormcaller. With a final surge of power, he brought the blade down. Lightning struck Vorthar from all directions, reducing the Void General to particles of darkness that scattered and faded like smoke in a strong wind. As suddenly as it had begun, the energy storm subsided. Eryon stood alone in the cavern, the pool once again still around his feet. The heart of storms was gone, but he could feel its power within him, integrated with his own. "Well done," came Calith's voice, though she remained invisible. "The first true fragment has been reclaimed. The path to reintegration has begun." "What happens now?" Eryon asked, stepping out of the pool. His armor was in tatters, but the wound beneath had healed completely. "Now you return to your allies," she replied. "They need you more than ever. Vorthar's defeat will buy time, but Vorthar has other servants, other plans." "And you? Will I see you again?" A soft laugh echoed through the cavern. "I am always with you, Eryon. In every incarnation, in every cycle. The form may change, but the essence remains." The blue light of the cavern began to fade, replaced by a more natural illumination from the phosphorescent fungi. As it did, Eryon noticed a tunnel opening that hadn't been visible before, leading upward. "That will take you back to your friends," Calith's voice confirmed, growing fainter. "Remember what you've learned here. Remember who you truly are." With those words, her presence faded completely, leaving Eryon alone with his thoughts and his newly expanded power. He sheathed Stormcaller and started up the tunnel, his mind already turning to what awaited above. The battle for Iron Deep might be over, but the war was just beginning, and now, at least, he had a clearer understanding of what they were fighting for, not just survival, but the restoration of a balance broken eons ago. Whether that was possible remained to be seen. But for the first time since Calith's death in the resistance camp, Eryon felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Chapter 8. The Heart of Darkness. The tunnel Calith had revealed led Eryon through a maze of natural passages, steadily ascending toward the upper levels of Iron Deep. As he climbed, he felt the changes wrought by absorbing the heart of storms. His senses seemed sharper, his awareness of the world around him expanded. He could feel the air currents in the tunnels, sense the subtle electromagnetic fields generated by the crystal formations embedded in the walls. More significantly, the magic within him had changed. The constant whispers of power had transformed into something more harmonious, less demanding. The divine spark felt less like an alien presence and more like an integral part of himself, still immensely powerful, but now aligned with his will rather than fighting against it. After what felt like hours of climbing, Eryon emerged into a familiar section of Iron Deep, one of the lower storage areas near the Great Forge. The sounds of activity reached him, voices, the clang of metal, the hum of machinery. The defenders had survived, at least in part. 2 dwarven guards spotted him as he approached the forge entrance. They raised their weapons, then lowered them in shock as they recognized him. "Eltharion!" one exclaimed. "By the deep stone, we thought you dead." "Not yet," Eryon replied with a tired smile, though not for lack of trying on the enemy's part. "Is Commander Tharok inside?" "Aye, planning our next move with the others. They'll want to see you right away." The guards escorted him into the Great Forge, a vast chamber dominated by massive furnaces and anvils sized for dwarven smiths. Currently, it served as both refuge and command center, with the wounded occupying one section, while strategy sessions continued in another. Heads turned as Eryon entered, conversations halting mid-sentence. "Tea?" A cheer went up, starting with the fighters who had seen him face Morthax and spreading throughout the chamber. Tharok pushed through the crowd, his weathered face showing rare emotion. "You stubborn fool," he growled, though there was relief in his voice. "How did you survive that collapse?" "It's a long story," Eryon replied, "but the short version is that Morthax is dead, and I've acquired something that might help us turn the tide." That got everyone's attention. Tharok led him to the command area where Durnak, the two Liaras, and a recovering Rin were gathered around a table strewn with maps and reports. "Look what the cave bats dragged in," Tharok announced. Durnak grinned broadly. "I knew it would take more than a tunnel collapse to finish you. Dwarven engineering isn't what it used to be." "The tunnel collapsed exactly as planned," Tharok retorted. "It's not my fault this one decided to play hero." The Liaras studied Eryon with identical expressions of keen interest. "You've changed," they said in unison, then glanced at each other in mild annoyance. "The heart of storms," the violet-skinned Liara continued alone. "You found it." "More accurately, I took it from Morthax," Eryon corrected. "It dissolved when I touched it. The power is part of me now." "The first true reintegration," the other Liara murmured. "Fascinating. How do you feel?" "Different," Eryon admitted. "More balanced. The magic doesn't fight me anymore." Rin, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "That's all very mystical and impressive, but what does it mean practically? Can you kill more orcs with it? Because we've still got thousands surrounding this mountain." "Actually, we don't," Durnak interjected. "Something strange happened about 2 hours ago. The enemy forces suddenly withdrew, abandoning their positions around Iron Deep. Our scouts report they're moving east at speed." "When exactly was this?" Eryon asked, a suspicion forming. Tharok consulted a timepiece. "Around midday. Why?" "That's when I killed Morthax," Eryon explained. "Without their commander, they must have received new orders." "Or they're regrouping for a larger assault," Rin suggested pessimistically. "Either way, it gives us breathing room," Tharok said pragmatically. "Time to tend our wounded, repair defenses, and figure out our next move." "Which brings us to the current discussion," the violet-skinned Liara said. "With the eastern boundary completely collapsed and the southern failing, Vorthar's influence spreads rapidly through both realms. We need to strike at the source." "The prison," Eryon said, understanding immediately. "We need to reinforce it before it breaks completely." "Exactly," she confirmed. "But to do that, we need to reach it, and the only path now lies through the heart of enemy territory." Durnak tapped a location on the map, a mountain range far to the east, in what Eryon recognized as the Carpathians of his world. "The Black Spire," the dwarf explained. "Vorthar's prison and the center of his power. Once there were multiple approaches protected by wards and guardians. Now only one remains, and it's overrun with his forces." "How many would we need to fight through?" Eryon asked, studying the map. "Thousands," Tharok replied grimly. "Perhaps tens of thousands. More than we could ever hope to defeat conventionally." "Then we don't fight conventionally," Eryon decided. "We need a small team, fast and stealthy, to infiltrate rather than confront directly." Rin laughed without humor. "Infiltrate an army of orcs, undead and void creatures? Good luck with that." "Not luck," Eryon said, his hand moving to the pendant at his chest. "Planning, skill, and a bit of divine intervention." The two Liaras exchanged glances. "It could work," the first one acknowledged, "especially with the Heart of Storms now part of him. The power over elements could provide cover, distractions." "And the rest of us?" Tharok demanded. "Sit here and wait while you run off on a suicide mission." "No," Eryon replied firmly. "We need a coordinated effort. While the infiltration team moves toward the Black Spire, the main resistance forces should launch diversionary attacks, draw attention away from us." "That's asking my people to die as a distraction," Tharok pointed out bluntly. "I'm asking them to fight smartly," Eryon corrected. "Hit-and-run tactics, Targeted strikes against supply lines and smaller outposts. The goal isn't to win battles, but to create chaos and confusion in their ranks. Dernak stroked his beard thoughtfully. It could work. My warriors excel at that kind of fighting, and I might be able to convince some of the other exiled clans to join us, now that we've proven we can hurt Vorthar's forces. What about the human governments? Rin asked. The veil is thinning enough that they can't ignore what's happening much longer. Could they provide support? Unlikely, the violet-skinned Liara replied. They still interpret these events through their limited worldview. Terrorist attacks, natural disasters, mass hallucinations. By the time they accept the truth, it may be too late. We work with what we have, Eryon decided. Tharok, can your forces be ready to begin diversionary operations within 3 days? The dwarf commander nodded reluctantly. We'll be ready. But I want to be clear. I don't like this plan. It puts too much weight on too few shoulders. Sometimes that's the only way, Eryon replied quietly. Large armies can't move quickly or secretly, and time is the one resource we're running out of. Who would go with you? Dernak asked practically. This infiltration team would need very specific skills. Eryon considered the question. Myself, obviously, one of the Liaras for magical expertise and knowledge of the prison. I will go, the violet-skinned Liara volunteered immediately. My counterpart can coordinate the magical defenses here and with the diversionary forces. I'd like Dernak as well, Eryon continued. Your knowledge of underground passages and defensive structures would be invaluable. The dwarf grinned. Try to leave me behind and I'll follow anyway. Might as well make it official. And me, Rin added unexpectedly. You'll need a scout. Someone who can move ahead and identify threats before you blunder into them. Eryon studied the wounded man skeptically. You're still recovering. I'll be ready, Rin insisted. And I know Vorthar's forces better than anyone here. I've spent 15 years tracking their movements, learning their patterns. After a moment's consideration, Eryon nodded. 4 then, small enough to move quickly, diverse enough in skills to handle what we might face. 5, came a new voice from the edge of the group. All heads turned to see a slender figure step forward, a human woman with short-cropped black hair and eyes that shifted color as she moved. She wore light armor of unfamiliar design, with numerous small pouches and vials attached to her belt. Who are you? Tharok demanded, hand moving to his weapon. Liara knows me, the woman replied, nodding to the violet-skinned elf. Nessa, Liara acknowledged with a slight bow. I wondered when you would appear. You know her? Eryon asked, sensing there was more to this newcomer than met the eye. Nessa is difficult to explain, Liara said carefully. She exists somewhat outside the normal flow of time and space, a consequence of experiments conducted by the Elven High Council centuries ago. I'm a temporal anomaly, Nessa clarified with a sardonic smile. Or in simpler terms, I tend to show up when and where I'm needed, whether I want to or not. And you're needed on this mission? Dernak asked skeptically. Nessa shrugged. Apparently, I was tracking orc movements near what you call the southern boundary when I was suddenly pulled here. That usually means something important is happening. What skills do you bring? Eryon asked directly. Alchemy, primarily, she replied, gesturing to the vials on her belt. Poisons, explosives, healing compounds. I'm also decent with knives and can move quietly when needed. Eryon glanced at Liara, who nodded almost imperceptibly. 5, then, he decided. We leave at dawn tomorrow. That gives us time to gather supplies and intelligence. The meeting broke up shortly after, each member of the newly formed team going to prepare in their own way. Eryon found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the forge where the wounded were being treated. Among them was a young elven woman whose injuries reminded him painfully of Calith's final moments. As he watched the healers work, the first Liara approached, standing silently beside him for a moment before speaking. You're thinking of her, she observed softly. Eryon didn't pretend to misunderstand. I see her everywhere, in the wounded, in battle, in quiet moments like this, sometimes literally, as in the Nexus cavern. The connection between you transcends physical death, Liara said. It always has, through every cycle. That's what troubles me, Eryon admitted. If we succeed, if we somehow end the cycle permanently, what happens to her? Does she find peace, or does she simply cease to exist? Liara's ageless eyes held compassion. I don't know. The texts speak of reintegration, of balance restored, but they say little about those bound to the cycle in other ways. Then we need to find out, Eryon said firmly, before we reach the Black Spire. I won't trade her existence for the world's salvation. There has to be a way to achieve both. Perhaps there is, Liara agreed. The Nexus Cavern where you encountered her, it suggests possibilities. The boundaries between worlds grow thin, yes, but that thinning works in both directions. What was separate may become whole again. Meaning? Meaning that reintegration might not be limited to the divine spark you carry, she explained. All aspects of the original balance might be restored, including those that exist between life and death, between one cycle and the next. It wasn't a definitive answer, but it offered a glimmer of hope. Eryon held on to that as he continued his preparations, checking his armor, sharpening Stormcaller's already keen edge, and studying the maps of the territory they would need to cross. The journey to the Black Spire would take them through the most dangerous regions of both realms, areas where the boundary had collapsed completely, where reality itself had become unstable. Even with his enhanced powers, it would be a perilous undertaking. As evening fell, Eryon sought out a quiet place to meditate, to center himself before the challenges ahead. He found a small balcony overlooking an underground lake, its surface reflecting the glow of crystals embedded in the cavern ceiling. He sat cross-legged, Stormcaller laid across his knees, and closed his eyes. The power within him responded immediately, no longer the chaotic force it had once been, but something more controlled, more harmonious. He could feel it flowing through his body, connecting him to the elements around him, the stone of the mountain, the water of the lake, the air in the cavern. Finding balance, came Nessa's voice from behind him. Eryon opened his eyes but didn't turn. Trying to... The temporal anomaly moved to sit beside him, her movements graceful and precise. Up close, Eryon could see faint lines of energy beneath her skin, pulsing with an irregular rhythm. Liara told me about you, Nessa said after a moment. The divine spark, the cycle, all of it. It's a heavy burden. No heavier than being a temporal anomaly, I imagine, Eryon replied. Nessa laughed softly. True enough, we all have our crosses to bear. Mine is never knowing when I might be yanked from one time or place to another. Yours is carrying the fate of two worlds on your shoulders. Why did you volunteer for this mission? Eryon asked, curious about this strange woman who existed outside normal time. I told you. I don't volunteer. I appear where I'm needed. She held up a hand as Eryon began to protest. But if you're asking why I think I'm needed, I have certain knowledge that might prove useful. What kind of knowledge? Nessa's eyes shifted from blue to green as she gazed out over the lake. In my travels, I've seen many versions of events, many possible outcomes to this conflict. Some where Vorthar wins, some where he's imprisoned again, continuing the cycle, and a very few, where something else happens entirely. That caught Eryon's full attention. Something else? Like what? Like reintegration, she said simply. Like the restoration of the original balance, the healing of the rift between creation and destruction. You've seen it succeed? Eryon asked, hope rising within him. Nessa's expression grew cautious. I've seen it attempted. The outcome varies. It depends on choices made along the way, on understanding gained or lost, on sacrifices accepted or rejected. That's frustratingly vague. Time usually is, she replied with a shrug. I can't tell you exactly what to do or how to do it. That would interfere with the natural flow of events, potentially creating worse outcomes. But I can be there, can offer perspective when critical moments arrive. Eryon studied her, trying to determine if she was being deliberately cryptic or genuinely constrained by her unusual nature. Can you at least tell me if Calith survives, in the versions where reintegration succeeds? Nessa's eyes shifted again, this time to a deep violet that reminded Eryon painfully of Calith herself. That, she said softly, is the question at the heart of everything, isn't it? What happens to those caught in the cycle when the cycle itself ends? And the answer? Is something you'll have to discover for yourself, she replied, rising to her feet. But I will say this. In the versions I've seen where balance is truly restored, nothing that matters is ever truly lost. It may be transformed, may take new shape, but its essence remains. With those enigmatic words, she left him to his meditation. Eryon watched her go, wondering if her presence was a good omen or simply another complication in an already complex situation. He returned his attention to the lake, to the reflection of crystals on its surface. The pendant at his chest pulsed gently, in rhythm with his heartbeat. The heart of Storm's power flowed through him, integrated but still distinct, like a new muscle he was learning to use. Tomorrow they would begin their journey to the Black Spire, to the heart of darkness itself. Whatever awaited them there, whatever choices he would face, whatever sacrifices might be demanded, Eryon was determined to find a path that saved not just the world, but those he cared for within it, especially Calith, whose fate seemed bound to his own in ways even the ageless Liara didn't fully understand. Dawn came too quickly. The infiltration team gathered at Iron Deep's eastern exit, a small postern door designed for scouting parties rather than main forces. Each member carried only essential supplies: food, water, weapons, and in Nessa's case, her mysterious alchemical concoctions. Tharok and the first Liara came to see them off. The dwarf commander looked grim but determined. "My forces will begin diversionary operations tomorrow," he informed them. "Small strikes against outposts and supply lines at first, building to larger actions as you get closer to the Black Spire. With luck, we'll draw enough attention that you can slip through their defenses." "Luck has little to do with it," the violet-skinned Liara said confidently. "The divine spark grows stronger as we approach the prison. Eryon's powers will increase accordingly. Just make sure you use them wisely," her counterpart cautioned. "Power without control is worse than no power at all," Eryon finished. "I remember the lessons." Tharok clasped forearms with each member of the team, a dwarven gesture of respect and farewell. "Return if you can," he said gruffly. "Die well if you must." With those encouraging words they set out into the pre-dawn darkness. Rin took point, his wound apparently healed enough for him to move with the silent grace that had kept him alive for 15 years in enemy territory. Dernak and the violet-skinned Liara followed, with Nessa and Eryon bringing up the rear. Their first goal was to reach the Shadowwood, a forest that had once marked the eastern boundary between realms. Now it existed in both simultaneously, a place of twisted reality where the laws of physics bent and sometimes broke entirely. "The Shadowwood provides our best chance of avoiding detection," Rin explained, as they moved through the foothills surrounding Iron Deep. "Vorthar's forces patrol its edges but rarely venture deep inside. The spatial distortions confuse even the Voidwalkers." "And us?" Dernak asked practically. "How do we avoid getting lost in there?" "I can navigate it," the violet-skinned Liara assured him. "The distortions follow patterns that respond to elven magic, and with Eryon's enhanced perception, we should be able to find the safest path through." They travelled through the day, keeping to ravines and dense underbrush to avoid the occasional orc patrol. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 20 miles. Good progress, but still only a fraction of the distance to the Black Spire. As they made camp in a sheltered hollow, Eryon found himself drawn to a nearby stream. The water called to him somehow, the elemental connection strengthened by the heart of storms. He knelt beside it, trailing his fingers through the cool current. Images formed in the ripples, fleeting visions of other places, other times. He saw Tharok leading a raid against an orc encampment, the resistance fighters striking swiftly and withdrawing before reinforcements could arrive. He saw the human city of Eastridge, its citizens beginning to panic as the veil thinned enough for them to glimpse the creatures that had previously been invisible to them. And most disturbingly, he saw the Black Spire itself, a towering needle of obsidian rock thrust up from the earth like a weapon. Around its base, a vast army gathered, larger than any he had seen before. At its peak, a pulsing red light beat like a malevolent heart, growing stronger with each throb. "Scrying through water?" Nessa asked, approaching quietly. That's a new trick. Eryon withdrew his hand, the images vanishing instantly. Not intentional. The elements respond to me differently now. The heart of storms, she nodded. It's changing you, integrating with the divine spark. What did you see? War, Eryon replied simply. And our destination. The Black Spire is heavily defended. Did you expect otherwise? Nessa asked, sitting beside him. It's Vorthar's prison and the center of his power. Of course he'd protect it. The army there is massive, Eryon explained. Far larger than what we faced at Iron Deep. Tharok's diversions won't make much difference against such numbers. Nessa studied him thoughtfully. Perhaps that's not their purpose. Perhaps the diversions aren't meant to draw forces away from the spire, but to prevent additional forces from reaching it. It was an interesting perspective, one Eryon hadn't considered. If Tharok could disrupt supply lines and communication, it might prevent Vorthar from consolidating his forces even further. Either way, Nessa continued, our approach remains the same. We can't fight our way through that army. We need to find another path. The Shadowwood might provide one, Eryon agreed. If the spatial distortions are as significant as Rin suggests, perhaps they can bring us closer to the spire than conventional travel would allow. Now you're thinking like a temporal anomaly, Nessa said with a smile. Space and time aren't as fixed as most believe. They can be negotiated with, under the right circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by Rin's return from a scouting expedition. The scout's expression was grim as he joined them by the stream. We've got trouble, he reported without preamble. A large force moving this way from the east. At least 500 orcs, plus undead and what look like trolls. Trolls? Dernak asked, joining them with the violet-skinned Liara. I thought they remained neutral in this conflict. Not anymore, apparently, Rin replied. These wore the mark of Vorthar, a red eye on black shields. How long until they reach us? Eryon asked. Dawn, at their current pace. They're following the stream, using it as a guide. Eryon looked at the water flowing peacefully beside them. Then we need to be gone before dawn. How far to the Shadowwood? Another day's journey normally, Rin said. But if we push through the night... We push, Eryon decided. Break camp now. We move in 10 minutes. The night journey was grueling. They abandoned the relatively easy terrain near the stream for a more direct route through rough hills and dense thickets. Dernak, despite his stocky build, kept pace admirably, his dwarven endurance proving its worth. Liara moved with elven grace, while Nessa seemed almost to flow around obstacles rather than navigate them. Rin led them unerringly toward their destination, his knowledge of the territory proving invaluable. Twice they froze as orc patrols passed nearby, and once they were forced to detour around a camp of what appeared to be human mercenaries working for Vorthar. Traitors, Rin spat after they were safely past, selling out their own kind for gold or power. Or protection, Nessa suggested more charitably. Fear makes people do desperate things. As the eastern sky began to lighten, they crested a final ridge and beheld their destination. The Shadowwood stretched before them, a vast forest unlike any Eryon had seen before. The trees were enormous, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes, their foliage shifting colours even as they watched. In some places, the forest seemed to fade partially from view, becoming transparent before solidifying again. The boundary collapse is most evident here, the violet-skinned Liara explained. What you're seeing is the forest existing in both realms simultaneously, phasing between them. Is it safe to enter? Dernak asked dubiously. Safe? No, Rin replied bluntly. But safer than facing that orc army behind us. As if to emphasize his point, war horns sounded in the distance. The force Rin had spotted was on the move, and closer than they had hoped. No choice now, Eryon said grimly. Into the wood. They descended the ridge quickly, approaching the edge of the Shadowwood as the sun broke over the horizon. Up close, the forest was even more disorienting. Trees appeared and disappeared at random intervals. The ground itself seemed uncertain, sometimes solid, sometimes insubstantial. Stay close, the violet-skinned Liara instructed. I'll establish a binding to keep us together regardless of the phase shifts. She murmured words in ancient Elvish, her hands weaving complex patterns in the air. A faint purple light surrounded each member of the team, connecting them with gossamer threads of energy. "This will maintain our relative positions even if the forest tries to separate us," she explained. "But it won't last indefinitely. We need to find the path through as quickly as possible." With Liara's magic protecting them, they entered the shadow wood. Immediately, Eryon felt the difference. A subtle pressure against his skin, a disorienting shift in his perception. Colours seemed more vivid, sounds both muffled and somehow clearer. The divine spark within him responded to the strange environment, power flowing more readily through his veins. "Which way?" he asked Rin, who was studying the forest with narrowed eyes. The scout pointed northeast. "The black spire lies in that direction, but in here, direction is flexible." "I can feel the currents," Eryon said, extending his senses as he had at the stream. "The forest has its own flow, like water or air." "Yes," the violet-skinned Liara confirmed. "The spatial distortions create channels, paths of lesser resistance. If we follow them, we can cover greater distances than should be physically possible." "And if we fight against them?" Dernak asked. "Then we might walk for days and emerge exactly where we entered," she replied. "Or worse, become trapped between phases, unable to fully exist in either realm." With that cheerful thought in mind, they began their journey through the Shadowwood. Eryon took the lead now, his enhanced senses allowing him to perceive the currents Liara had described. They appeared to him as faint blue lines in the air, flowing between trees and around obstacles. The forest grew denser as they progressed, the trees pressing closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the sun. Time became difficult to track. Moments seemed to stretch into hours, then compress suddenly into seconds. More than once, Eryon found himself taking a step and covering what should have been hundreds of yards. "The distortions are growing stronger," the violet-skinned Liara observed. "We're approaching a nexus point." "Like the cavern beneath Iron Deep?" Eryon asked, remembering his encounter with Calith. "Similar but less stable," she replied. "The nexus beneath Iron Deep has existed for millennia, its energies carefully balanced. This one is new, formed by the boundary collapse." They emerged into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. A perfect circle of open ground surrounded by trees that bent away as if repelled by some invisible force. At the center stood a single white tree, its bark luminescent, its leaves a metallic silver that chimed softly in a wind none of them could feel. "The heart of the wood," Liara breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "I didn't think it was real." "What is it?" Nessa asked, her eyes shifting rapidly through colors as she studied the tree. "A manifestation point," Liara explained. "A place where the essence of the forest has concentrated itself. Legend says it appears only in times of great change, when the fate of both realms hangs in the balance." Eryon approached the tree cautiously. As he drew near, the chiming of the leaves grew louder, forming patterns that almost resembled speech. The divine spark within him responded, power flowing outward involuntarily. The white tree's trunk split open, revealing a hollow interior filled with swirling light. Within that light, a figure began to take shape, humanoid but not human, its features fluid and constantly changing. "Eryon," it said, its voice like the chiming leaves multiplied 1,000-fold. "Fragment of the Creator, vessel of the divine spark, you are known to us." "Who are you?" Eryon asked, his hand instinctively moving to Stormcaller's hilt. "We are the Guardians," the figure replied. "Watchers of the boundaries, keepers of the balance. We have existed since the Sundering, since Eryon and Vorthar first broke faith with each other." The violet-skinned Liara stepped forward, bowing deeply. "We seek passage through the Shadowwood," she said formally, "to the Black Spire, where Vorthar's prison weakens." "We know your purpose," the Guardian replied, "as we know the purpose of all who enter our domain. The question is not where you go, but why you go there." Its gaze fixed on Eryon. "You seek reintegration, the restoration of what was sundered. But do you understand what this means? What it will require of you?" "I'm beginning to," Eryon answered honestly. "Each fragment I reclaim brings greater understanding. The Heart of Storms showed me glimpses of what once was, of the balance that existed before the conflict. Glimpses only. the Guardian cautioned. "The full truth would overwhelm your mortal vessel, yet you must understand enough to make the choice that comes." "What choice?" Eryon asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Between vengeance and forgiveness," the Guardian said simply. "Between continuing the cycle and ending it. Between destruction and creation." The figure gestured, and the swirling light within the tree expanded, enveloping Eryon completely. His companions cried out in alarm, but their voices seemed distant, muffled by the light that surrounded him. Within that light, Eryon found himself no longer in the clearing, but standing on a vast plain beneath a sky filled with stars unlike any he had seen before. Before him stood two figures, one radiant with golden light, the other wrapped in shadow. Despite their different appearances, they were clearly the same being, two aspects of a single entity. "This is how it began," came the Guardian's voice, though the figure itself was nowhere to be seen. "Eryon and Vorthar, creation and destruction, two faces of the same cosmic force, in balance, in harmony, maintaining the great cycle of existence." The scene shifted. The golden figure and the shadow grew distinct from each other, separating into two beings that circled one another warily. "But balance is difficult to maintain," the Guardian continued. "Creation flourished, life multiplied, and with it came consciousness, choice, free will. Destruction was necessary, the old making way for the new, but it was feared, shunned, relegated to the shadows." The shadow figure grew darker, more defined, its movements becoming aggressive. The golden figure responded defensively, its light intensifying. "Vorthar grew resentful," the Guardian explained. "His necessary role in the cosmic order brought him no love, no worship from the beings Eryon had created. He began to desire not just his rightful domain, but dominion over all existence." The shadow attacked the light, and a battle unlike anything Eryon could comprehend erupted across the plain. Mountains rose and fell, oceans boiled and froze, reality itself warped under the force of their conflict. "The war between them threatened to unmake all of creation," the Guardian said. "Eryon realized that neither could destroy the other without unraveling the fabric of existence itself, so he made a desperate choice." The golden figure suddenly stopped fighting. Instead, it began to fragment, pieces of its essence separating and scattering. The largest portion formed a cage of light around the shadow, containing but not destroying it. "He used his own power to imprison Vorthar," the Guardian continued, "and fragmented the rest of his essence to maintain the balance in his absence. The largest fragments were embedded in bloodlines that would awaken when needed. Others were hidden throughout both realms, in objects, in places of power, in concepts and emotions that embodied aspects of his nature." The scene faded, returning Eryon to the clearing with the white tree. His companions stood frozen, as if time had stopped for them while he experienced the vision. "Now you begin to understand," the Guardian said. "The cycle continues because the prison weakens without Erion's full power to maintain it. Each time a fragment awakens to renew the prison, but never to heal the original rift." "Until now," Eryon said, comprehension dawning. "Because I'm reclaiming the fragments, integrating them, becoming more of what Eryon originally was." "Yes," the Guardian confirmed. "But reintegration brings a choice. Vorthar was not always the enemy. He was the other half of the cosmic balance, necessary for the proper functioning of existence. What was sundered can be made whole again, not through destruction, but through reconciliation." "You're saying I should forgive Vorthar?" Eryon asked incredulously. "After everything he's done? The deaths, the suffering, the corruption he's spread?" "We say only that continuing the cycle, fighting, imprisoning, repeating, has failed to provide a permanent solution," the Guardian replied. "The choice of what to do instead is yours alone. But know this: true reintegration requires the healing of all rifts, not just the reclaiming of fragments." The Guardian began to fade back into the tree. "We will grant you passage through the Shadowwood, opening a path directly to the edge of Vorthar's domain. What you do when you arrive is your choice. But remember what you have seen here. Remember the truth of how this began." With those words, the figure vanished completely, and the white tree sealed itself once more. Time resumed for Eryon's companions, who looked around in confusion. "What happened?" Dernak demanded. "You were surrounded by light and then—" "I received a history lesson," Eryon replied, his mind still processing what he had witnessed, "and a choice I'm not sure I can make." Before he could explain further, the trees around the clearing began to move, rearranging themselves to form a distinct path leading eastward. The path glowed faintly blue, similar to the currents Eryon had been following earlier. "The Guardians have granted us passage," the violet-skinned Liara said with awe. "This is unprecedented. They normally remain neutral in conflicts between realms." "Maybe they're tired of the cycle too," Nessa suggested, studying Eryon with knowing eyes. "Maybe they want to see if this time will be different." Rin, ever practical, was already examining the new path. "It looks stable, at least for now. We should move while we have the chance." Eryon nodded, pushing aside his troubled thoughts for the moment. "Lead on. We have a long way to go and time is still against us." As they followed the glowing path deeper into the Shadowwood, Eryon found himself wrestling with the implications of the Guardian's vision. The idea that Vorthar had once been part of the cosmic balance, that his corruption stemmed from resentment at being shunned and feared, complicated the narrative of good versus evil that had driven his campaign of vengeance. If true reintegration required healing all rifts, did that mean he would need to somehow reconcile with Vorthar rather than simply defeating him? The thought seemed impossible, even repugnant after witnessing the suffering the Dark God had caused. Yet the cycle had repeated for millennia without resolution. Perhaps a different approach was indeed necessary, however difficult it might be to accept. These thoughts occupied Eryon as they travelled the Guardian's path, moving through the Shadowwood at an accelerated pace. Trees blurred around them, distances compressed, time itself seeming to bend to accommodate their journey. By what felt like midday, but could have been any time at all in the disorienting forest, they began to notice changes in their surroundings. The trees grew darker, their trunks twisted into tortured shapes. The air became heavier, carrying a faint scent of decay and something else, a metallic tang that reminded Eryon of blood. "We're approaching the edge of Vorthar's domain," the violet-skinned Liara warned. "The forest here is corrupted by his influence." "How much farther to the exit?" Dernak asked, his hand resting on his warhammer. "Not far," Rin replied, studying the path ahead. "But something's wrong. The path is fading." Indeed, the blue glow that had guided them was growing dimmer, patches of it disappearing entirely. The trees that had arranged themselves so neatly were beginning to shift back to their natural positions. "The Guardian's influence wanes as Vorthar's grows stronger," Liara explained. "We need to hurry before the path disappears completely." They quickened their pace, jogging now despite the risk of making noise. The forest around them grew increasingly hostile, branches reaching out as if to grab them, roots rising from the ground to trip unwary feet. The very air seemed to resist their passage, growing thick and difficult to breathe. Finally, they glimpsed light ahead, not the dappled sunlight of the forest interior, but a harsh red glow that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. The path led directly toward it, its blue illumination now barely visible. "The edge of the Shadowwood," Liara confirmed. "Beyond lies the blasted plain, and beyond that, the black spire itself." They approached the forest's edge cautiously. The trees here were completely corrupted, their bark black and oozing a substance that looked disturbingly like blood. The ground beneath their feet had changed from soil to a glassy, obsidian-like surface that reflected the red light from beyond. Rin moved ahead to scout the transition point, disappearing among the twisted trunks. He returned moments later, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he reported. "The forest ends at a cliff overlooking the plain. It's at least 100 feet down with no obvious path. And the plain below is crawling with Vorthar's forces, thousands of them, camped in concentric rings around the black spire." "The Guardian's path leads us to a dead end?" Dernak asked incredulously. "Not necessarily," the violet-skinned Liara replied thoughtfully. "The Guardians operate on a different level of reality than we do. Their concept of passage might not align with our expectations." "Meaning?" Eryon prompted. Meaning we should see exactly where the path ends before we dismiss it as useless, she suggested. They followed the now faint blue glow to the very edge of the forest. As Rin had reported, it ended at a sheer cliff that dropped to a vast plain below. The plain stretched for miles, a blasted wasteland of black glass and jagged rock formations. Scattered across its surface were the encampments of Vorthar's army. Orcs, trolls, undead, and creatures Eryon couldn't even identify, all arranged in military precision around the central feature of the landscape. The black spire rose from the center of the plain like a massive thorn thrust up from the earth's heart. It towered thousands of feet into the air, its surface gleaming with the same obsidian-like material that covered the plain. At its peak, a pulsing red light beat like a malevolent heart, sending waves of crimson energy cascading down the spire's length. Vorthar's prison, the violet-skinned Liara said softly, and the source of his power. The red light is his essence growing stronger as the prison weakens. How are we supposed to reach it? Dernak demanded, gesturing to the cliff and the army below. Sprout wings and fly? As if in answer, the faint blue path they had been following suddenly intensified, extending out from the cliff edge into empty air. It hovered there, a bridge of light spanning the gap between the forest and nothing visible. What in the deep hells is that supposed to be? The dwarf muttered. Nessa stepped forward, her eyes shifting rapidly through colours as she studied the phenomenon. It's a temporal bridge, she said, with something like awe in her voice. The Guardians aren't just showing us a path through space, but through time. Explain, Eryon requested, his gaze fixed on the shimmering blue path extending into empty air. The Guardians exist partially outside our normal flow of time, Nessa explained, her eyes shifting to a deep indigo. This bridge doesn't just cross physical space, it traverses temporal space as well. If we follow it, we'll move through a fold in time where Vorthar's forces aren't positioned as they are now. A way to bypass the army entirely, Rin said, understanding dawning on his face. Precisely, Nessa confirmed. The boundary collapse has created instabilities in both space and time. The Guardians are showing us one such instability we can exploit. Dernak frowned skeptically. So we just walk across this bridge of light into another time. And then what? How do we get back? We don't need to get back, the violet-skinned Liara interjected. We only need to reach the Black Spire. Once there, our actions will affect all timelines, all moments. The prison exists partially outside normal time already. Is it safe? Eryon asked, studying the glowing path. Nessa's expression grew serious. No temporal crossing is entirely safe. There are risks, disorientation, memory distortion, even physical effects if the transition isn't smooth. But I've navigated similar phenomena before. With my guidance and your divine spark to anchor us, our chances are good. Eryon considered their options. The cliff below them dropped to a plain swarming with thousands of Vorthar's soldiers. Even with his enhanced powers, fighting through such numbers would be impossible. The temporal bridge, dangerous as it might be, offered their only viable path forward. How do we cross? He asked Nessa. We form a chain, she replied. Physical contact is essential. It keeps us anchored to the same temporal stream. I'll guide, but you need to lead. The bridge responds to your divine spark. Eryon nodded. Form up. Nessa behind me, then Liara, Dernak and Rin at the rear. Keep contact at all times, no matter what you see or feel. They arranged themselves as directed, each grasping the shoulder or belt of the person ahead. Eryon took a deep breath, centering himself and feeling the power of the Heart of Storms pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Focus on the spire, Nessa instructed from behind him. It exists in all temporal variations. Let it anchor your perception. Eryon fixed his gaze on the distant black spire, its obsidian surface gleaming in the red light that pulsed from its peak. Then, with deliberate steps, he moved onto the bridge of light. The sensation was immediate and disorienting, like stepping into a swift-flowing river that pulled at not just his body but his consciousness. The world around them blurred, colours shifting and bleeding into one another. The red glow from the spire flickered, changing to orange, then yellow, then a deep violet before stabilizing into a pulsing blue. Keep moving, Nessa urged, her voice sounding strangely distant despite her proximity. Don't stop, don't hesitate. Eryon pressed forward, each step requiring more concentration than the last. The air grew thick, resistant, as if they were moving through water rather than across a bridge of light. Sounds became muffled, then distorted, whispers and fragments of conversation that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Temporal echoes, Nessa explained, her voice weaving in and out of clarity. Fragments of other moments, other possibilities. Among the whispers, one voice cut through with crystal clarity. Calith's voice, speaking words he had never heard her say. "The cycle breaks when forgiveness replaces vengeance," she said. "Remember this when you stand before him, Eryon. Remember what was before what is." He faltered momentarily, nearly breaking stride at the sound of her voice. Nessa's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Keep moving," she insisted. "The voices are real in their way, but we can't interact with them. Not here. Not now." With effort, Eryon pushed forward. Though Calith's words echoed in his mind, they aligned too perfectly with what the Guardian had shown him to be coincidence. Another piece of the puzzle. Another hint at what awaited him at the journey's end. The bridge began to descend gradually, bringing them closer to the transformed landscape below. The plain that had been covered with Vorthar's army was now empty, the black glass surface cracked and broken in places to reveal glowing blue veins beneath. "The temporal shift is stabilizing," the violet-skinned Liara observed. "We're approaching our destination moment." As she spoke, the bridge of light touched down on the plain, connecting seamlessly with the broken surface. The glowing path continued ahead, leading directly toward the black spire, which now pulsed with blue rather than red energy. "We've arrived," Nessa announced as they stepped off the bridge onto solid ground. "A different temporal fold, a different now." Eryon looked around, taking in their transformed surroundings. The plain was eerily empty, devoid of the thousands of soldiers that had occupied it in their original timeline. The black spire itself appeared subtly different, its surface less polished, more raw, with visible fractures running along its length. "Where are we?" Dernak asked, his hand resting on his warhammer. "Or perhaps when are we—" "Neither question quite applies," Nessa replied. "We're in a temporal fold, a pocket of time created by the boundary collapse. It's not the past or future, but a parallel moment that exists alongside our normal flow of time." "And Vorthar's forces?" Rin asked, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Not present in this fold," Nessa explained. "At least not yet. Temporal folds are unstable by nature. This one won't last indefinitely." "How long do we have?" Eryon asked. Nessa's eyes shifted through several colours before settling on a deep amber. "Hours at most. The fold is already beginning to degrade. We need to reach the spire before it collapses completely." "Then we move now," Eryon decided. "The path still leads forward. Let's follow it while we can." They set off across the broken plain, following the faint blue glow that continued to mark their route. The ground beneath their feet was treacherous, sharp obsidian shards and deep cracks that revealed pulsing blue energy below. The air carried a metallic tang, and occasional flashes of lightning arced between the ground and the swirling clouds above. "This place feels wrong," Dernak muttered as they navigated around a particularly large fissure, "like it's not fully formed." "That's precisely what it is," the violet-skinned Liara confirmed. "A reality in flux, caught between what was and what might be." They had covered perhaps half the distance to the spire when Rin, who had moved slightly ahead to scout, suddenly raised his hand in warning. The group froze, dropping into defensive postures. "Movement ahead," the scout reported quietly. "Something's emerging from the ground." Eryon followed Rin's gaze and saw it, the black glass surface bulging upward about 100 yards ahead, cracking and splitting as something pushed its way through from below. Similar disturbances were appearing across the plain, dozens of them, forming a rough semicircle that blocked their path to the spire. "The fold is destabilizing faster than I anticipated," Nessa said grimly. "The barriers between moments are thinning." From the nearest bulge, a figure emerged, humanoid but clearly not human. Its body appeared to be formed from the same obsidian material as the plane itself, with glowing blue veins running through its surface. It had no face, only a smooth reflective surface where features should be. "Void walkers," the violet-skinned Liara whispered. Vorthar's elite guardians. They exist partially outside normal space-time, which allows them to perceive and enter temporal folds. More of the creatures emerged from the ground, their faceless heads turning in unison toward the infiltration team. There were at least 20 of them now, with more still rising. "Can we fight them?" Dernak asked, hefting his warhammer. "Not conventionally," Liara replied. "They're not fully physical beings. Normal weapons pass through them unless empowered by specific magics." Eryon drew Stormcaller, the blade humming with energy as it responded to his intent. "Then it's fortunate we have unconventional weapons. Nessa, can you create a diversion? Something to draw their attention while we circle around?" The temporal anomaly nodded, reaching for several vials on her belt. "I have something that might work. Temporal displacement bombs. They create localized distortions that should confuse the Void Walker's perception." "Liara, can you shield us from their awareness?" Eryon continued. "Partially," the elf replied. "My magic can dampen our presence but not eliminate it entirely. And only for a short time. Such spells are difficult to maintain in this unstable environment." "It will have to do," Eryon decided. "Rin, find us a path around their formation. Dernak, you and I will guard the rear if any break through Nessa's diversion." The scout nodded and began studying the terrain, looking for the most efficient route. Nessa removed 3 small crystal vials from her belt, each containing a swirling silver liquid. "These will create a temporal disruption lasting approximately 2 minutes, she explained. "Throw them as far from our intended path as possible." Ryan took one of the vials, as did Dernak. On Nessa's count, they hurled the crystals toward the far side of the Voidwalker formation. The vials shattered on impact, releasing clouds of silver mist that expanded rapidly. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Where the mist touched, reality itself seemed to fracture, objects appearing and disappearing, the ground shifting between different states, afterimages trailing behind any movement. The Voidwalkers turned toward the disturbance, their faceless heads tilting in what might have been confusion. "Now!" Rin hissed, gesturing toward a path that skirted the edge of the formation. "Stay low and move quickly." The violet-skinned Liara began weaving her hands in complex patterns, murmuring words in ancient Elvish. A faint purple haze settled over the group, making their outlines blur slightly. "The concealment is active," she whispered, "but it won't last long in this environment. We need to move." They set off at a crouching run, following Rin's lead around the edge of the Voidwalker formation. The creatures remained focused on the temporal disruption, their faceless heads tracking the shifting reality created by Nessa's bombs. For a moment, it seemed the diversion would work perfectly. They had made it halfway around the formation when one of the Voidwalkers suddenly turned, its featureless face pointing directly at them despite the concealment spell. "We've been spotted," Rin warned. The creature made no sound, but its intention was clear as it began moving toward them with a fluid grace that belied its seemingly solid form. Others began to turn as well, abandoning the temporal disruption to focus on the infiltrators. "Run!" Eryon ordered. "Straight for the spire. No point in stealth now." They broke into a full sprint, abandoning the careful path Rin had plotted for a direct route toward their destination. The Voidwalkers pursued, moving with unnatural speed across the broken terrain. "They're gaining," Dernak reported, glancing back, "and more are emerging ahead." Indeed, new Voidwalkers were rising from the ground directly in their path, cutting off their route to the spire. Within moments, they would be surrounded. "Eryon!" the violet-skinned Liara called. "The heart of storms, its power might affect them." Eryon reached for the pendant at his chest, feeling the power pulsing within it. Since absorbing it, he had used its energy primarily to enhance his own abilities rather than as a direct weapon. But now, with enemies closing in from all sides, he needed something more. Focusing his will, he channeled the heart's power outward, not through Stormcaller, but directly from his body. The effect was immediate and far more powerful than he had anticipated. A wave of blue-white energy erupted from him in all directions, rippling across the plain like the shockwave from an explosion. Where it touched the Voidwalkers, their obsidian forms cracked and splintered, blue light pouring from the fissures. Several of the creatures simply disintegrated, while others staggered back, their smooth surfaces now webbed with glowing fractures. "It worked!" Dernak exclaimed. "They're vulnerable to the heart's power." "Not destroyed," Nessa cautioned, pointing to the damaged Voidwalkers that were already beginning to reform, the cracks in their surfaces sealing themselves. "Only temporarily disrupted. We need to move before they recover." Eryon felt drained from the massive expenditure of energy, but there was no time to rest. "Go," he ordered. "I'll hold them off if they get too close." They resumed their sprint toward the spire, which now loomed much closer. The blue light pulsing from its peak had intensified, beating like a heart in rhythm with the glowing veins that ran through the plain. The damaged Voidwalkers recovered more quickly than Nessa had anticipated, resuming their pursuit with renewed determination. More continued to emerge from the ground ahead, though they kept a wary distance after witnessing what had happened to their brethren. "We're not going to make it," Rin said grimly as they were forced to slow, hemmed in by Voidwalkers on all sides. "There are too many." Eryon raised Stormcaller, channeling what remained of his energy into the blade. Lightning crackled along its length, arcing between the runes etched into the metal. "We fight then, back to back, no one breaks formation." They formed a defensive circle, weapons ready as the Voidwalkers closed in. The creatures moved with eerie coordination, tightening their formation with each step. Just as the first Voidwalker came within striking distance, a new sound cut through the unnatural silence of the plain. A high, keening wail that seemed to come from the spire itself. The Voidwalkers froze, their faceless heads turning toward the source. The blue light pulsing from the spire's peak suddenly intensified, shooting upward into the swirling clouds before cascading back down in a wave that swept across the plain. Where it touched the Voidwalkers, they simply dissolved, their obsidian forms melting back into the ground from which they had emerged. "What's happening?" Dernak asked, lowering his warhammer slightly. "The prison is responding to your presence," came a new voice, familiar yet different, resonating with power that matched the pulsing light from the spire. They turned to see a figure approaching, a woman with violet skin and silver hair, wearing armor that seemed to be made of living crystal. Though none of them had seen her before, Eryon recognized her immediately. "Calith," he breathed, lowering Stormcaller. She smiled, though the expression held more sorrow than joy. "Yes and no. I am what remains of Calith in this temporal fold, an echo, a memory given form by the prison's power." "How is this possible?" the violet-skinned Liara asked, her voice filled with wonder. "The prison exists partially outside normal time," Calith's echo explained. "It preserves aspects of all who have been bound to the cycle. I sensed your arrival and awakened, for lack of a better term." She turned to Eryon, her eyes, the same violet he remembered so vividly, studying him with an intensity that made his heart ache. "You've changed since I last saw you. The Heart of Storms has integrated well." "You know about that?" Eryon asked. "I know many things in this state," she replied. "The boundaries between moments are thin here, allowing me to perceive across them. I know why you've come and what awaits you within the spire." "Vorthar," Eryon said grimly. "Yes, but not as you imagine him," Calith's echo cautioned. "The being imprisoned here is both more and less than the enemy you fought against. He is a fragment, just as you were, the largest piece of what was once a cosmic force of balance." Her words echoed what the Guardian had shown Eryon in the Shadowwood. "The original sundering," he said, "when Altharion split himself to imprison Vorthar." Calith nodded. "A desperate measure that was never meant to be permanent. The prison weakens with each cycle because it was designed to do so, to eventually allow for healing rather than eternal separation." "Healing?" Dernak interrupted skeptically. "After everything Vorthar has done? The deaths, the corruption, the suffering he's caused?" "The corruption is real," Calith acknowledged. "Eons of imprisonment have twisted what was once necessary destruction into malevolent chaos. But beneath that corruption lies the original essence, the counterbalance to creation that maintains the cosmic order." She turned back to Eryon. "This is the choice that awaits you within the spire. Not just to defeat Vorthar or renew his prison, but to heal the original sundering, to reintegrate what was separated." "How?" Eryon asked, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. How do I heal something so broken, so corrupted? By remembering what was before what is, Calith replied, echoing the words he had heard on the temporal bridge. By recognizing that vengeance perpetuates the cycle while forgiveness might end it. She gestured toward the spire. The path is clear now, but not for long. This temporal fold is collapsing. You must reach the prison chamber before it does. Will you come with us? Eryon asked, reluctant to leave her even knowing she was only an echo. Calith shook her head sadly. I cannot. My existence is bound to this specific fold. But know that I am with you in all moments, in all versions of reality. Our connection transcends physical presence. She stepped forward, placing her hand over his heart where the pendant rested beneath his armor. The heart of storms connects all elements, all aspects of existence. Use it not just as a weapon, but as a bridge, a means of reconnection. Before Eryon could respond, she leaned forward and kissed him gently. The contact sent a surge of energy through his body, replenishing what he had expended against the Voidwalkers and more. Now go, she said, stepping back. The fold collapses, and with it, this manifestation of me. Indeed, the world around them was beginning to destabilize. The cracks in the plane were widening, the blue light pulsing more erratically. In the distance, the temporal bridge they had crossed was fading from view. Thank you, Eryon said, knowing the words were inadequate but unable to find better ones. Calith smiled one last time. Remember what I told you. The cycle ends when forgiveness replaces venge. Ants. Find the balance that was lost, Eryon. Find it for all of us. With those words, she began to fade, her form becoming translucent before dissolving into motes of blue light that drifted toward the spire. We need to move, Nessa urged, her eyes shifting rapidly through colors as she assessed the collapsing fold. The instability is accelerating. Eryon nodded, forcing himself to focus on their mission despite the emotional impact of seeing Calith again, even as an echo. To the spire, quickly! They set off at a run, the path now clear of Voidwalkers. The ground beneath their feet grew increasingly unstable, sections of the plane disappearing entirely to reveal a swirling void beneath. The air itself seemed to be thinning, making each breath more difficult than the last. The fold is collapsing faster than I expected, Nessa called as they ran. We have minutes at most. The base of the spire loomed before them, its obsidian surface reflecting their distorted images as they approached. Unlike in their original timeline, there was no massive door or obvious entrance, just the seamless black surface stretching upward. How do we get in? Dernak demanded, placing his hand against the spire and finding it solid. The violet-skinned Liara studied the surface, her hands moving in arcane patterns. There's a resonance pattern. The prison responds to specific energies. The divine spark, Eryon realized. He stepped forward, placing his palm flat against the obsidian surface. Immediately he felt a response, a vibration that traveled up his arm and into his chest, connecting with the power of the heart of storms. The surface beneath his hand rippled like water, then parted, revealing a narrow passage leading into the spire's interior. Blue light pulsed from within, illuminating a spiral staircase that wound upward. The way is open, Eryon announced, but I don't think it will remain so for long. Then we don't waste time, Rin said practically. Lead on. Eryon entered first, followed by his companions. As the last of them passed through, the opening sealed behind them, leaving them in a corridor illuminated only by the pulsing blue veins that ran through the spire's interior walls. The staircase spiraled upward, seemingly endless. As they climbed, Eryon could feel the power growing stronger, both the familiar energy of the divine spark within him and something else, something darker but not necessarily malevolent. A counterpoint to his own power, a harmony in opposition. We're approaching the prison chamber, the violet-skinned Liara said after they had climbed for what felt like hours. The heart of the spire, where Vorthar is contained. The staircase ended at a circular platform suspended in what appeared to be the hollow center of the spire. Above them, the blue light they had seen from outside pulsed rhythmically, casting shifting shadows across the platform. Below, a seemingly bottomless void stretched into darkness. At the center of the platform stood a crystalline structure, a cage of light that contained a swirling mass of darkness. The darkness wasn't static. It moved constantly, forming and reforming into different shapes, sometimes almost humanoid, sometimes completely abstract. "Vorthar!" Eryon breathed, feeling the divine spark within him respond to the proximity of its ancient counterpart. The darkness reacted to his voice, coalescing into a more defined shape, a figure that might have been human once, before corruption and eons of imprisonment twisted it into something else. It had no distinct features, only a suggestion of a face with 2 points of crimson light where eyes should be. "Eltharion," the figure said, its voice a discordant harmony of multiple tones speaking simultaneously. "Fragment of my ancient enemy. Have you come to renew my prison once more?" Eryon stepped forward, Stormcaller drawn but held at his side rather than raised in threat. "I've come to end the cycle," he replied. "One way or another." The crimson lights that served as Vorthar's eyes flared brighter. "End it? How? By destroying me completely? Many have tried. All have failed. I am as eternal as creation itself." "Not by destruction," Eryon said, the words coming to him as if from some deeper knowledge. "By healing, by reintegration." The darkness within the crystal cage rippled, the suggestion of features shifting into what might have been surprise. "Reintegration? After eons of conflict, after all I have done to your precious worlds, you speak of healing rather than vengeance." "The Guardian showed me the truth," Eryon explained. "You were once part of the cosmic balance, necessary destruction to complement creation. Your corruption came after the sundering, after you were imprisoned and shunned." "Truth," Vorthar hissed, the darkness roiling within its cage. "What do you know of truth, Fragment? You who have lived but a fraction of a mortal lifetime, who carries only a spark of what Eltharion once was." "I know enough," Eryon replied steadily. "I know that continuing the cycle solves nothing. Each time the prison weakens, each time a new vessel of the divine spark rises to renew it, nothing truly changes. The balance remains broken." The platform beneath them shuddered suddenly, the blue light pulsing more erratically. Outside the spire, the temporal fold was collapsing completely. "We're running out of time," Nessa warned. "The fold is failing. When it does, we'll be thrown back into normal time, right in the middle of Vorthar's army." Eryon nodded, understanding the urgency. He turned back to the imprisoned entity. "I offer you a choice, Vorthar. Continued imprisonment, continued corruption, continued cycle of conflict, or healing, reintegration, a return to the balance that once was." "And how would you accomplish this miracle?" Vorthar demanded, though there was something new in its discordant voice, a note of curiosity, perhaps even hope. "The sundering cannot be undone by mortal means." "Not by mortal means alone," Eryon agreed. "But I carry more than just the divine spark now. I have reclaimed fragments of what was lost. Knowledge, power, understanding. And I have this." He removed the pendant from beneath his armor, revealing the heart of storms in all its glory. The crystal pulsed with blue-white light, responding to both his divine spark and the proximity of Vorthar's essence. "The heart of storms," Vorthar said, the crimson lights of its eyes fixed on the pendant. "A nexus of elemental forces, a bridge between realms. Yes, with this, reintegration might be possible, but at what cost to you, Fragment? Do you understand what you're proposing?" "I think I do," Eryon replied quietly. "To heal the sundering, to reintegrate what was separated, requires more than just releasing you from your prison. It requires the willing sacrifice of what we have become separately, to become something new together." "The end of Eryon," Vorthar observed. "The end of the identity you have built, the life you have lived. Are you prepared for that?" The question struck at the heart of Eryon's fears. To sacrifice himself, his identity, everything he had become, it was a price he hadn't fully considered until this moment. Would he still exist in some form after reintegration? Would his memories, his feelings, his connection to Calith remain? As if sensing his thoughts, Vorthar continued. "And what of those you care for? The violet-skinned warrior whose fate is bound to yours across cycles? What becomes of her if the cycle ends?" "That's what I intend to find out," Eryon said, his resolve strengthening as he remembered Calith's words. The cycle ends when forgiveness replaces vengeance. Find the balance that was lost. He turned to his companions, who had remained silent during the exchange. This is my choice to make, but you deserve to know what it means. If I proceed with reintegration, I don't know exactly what will happen. To me, to Vorthar, to the worlds we fought over for so long. But I believe it's the only way to truly end the cycle. You're talking about sacrificing yourself, Dernak said bluntly. Merging with that thing. Not merging with what it has become, Eryon clarified. Healing what it once was, what we both once were, parts of a greater whole, a cosmic balance that maintained the proper flow of creation and destruction. The violet-skinned Liara stepped forward, her ancient eyes filled with understanding. The texts speak of reintegration as the ultimate resolution, the healing of the original sundering, but they are unclear about what remains afterward. It's a leap of faith, Nessa observed, her eyes shifting through colours as she studied both Eryon and the imprisoned Vorthar. A choice made without knowing the outcome. Most important choices are, Rin added quietly. The question is whether the potential benefit outweighs the risk. Another tremor shook the platform, stronger than before. Cracks appeared in the obsidian walls of the spire, blue light pouring through them in erratic pulses. We're out of time, Nessa warned. The fold is collapsing completely. Decide now, Eryon. Eryon looked at each of his companions in turn, then back at the imprisoned entity that represented both his ancient enemy and, potentially, his other half. The divine spark within him pulsed in rhythm with the heart of storms, both seeming to pull him toward a decision he had already made in his heart. I choose reintegration, he said firmly. I choose to end the cycle, to heal what was sundered, to restore the balance that was lost. He stepped toward the crystal cage, the heart of storms held before him. And you, Vorthar? What do you choose? Continued imprisonment, continued corruption, or healing, reintegration, a return to what you once were? The darkness within the cage roiled and shifted, the crimson lights that served as eyes dimming momentarily before flaring brighter than before. Eons of imprisonment have taught me many things, Fragment. Chief among them is that there are fates worse than captivity, but there might also be states better than freedom. The suggestion of features within the darkness shifted into what might have been a smile. I choose as you do, reintegration, an end to what we have become, a return to what we once were. Then let it be done, Eryon said, raising the heart of storms high. The pendant pulsed with blue-white light, responding to his intent. Eryon channeled his power through it, not as a weapon but as a conduit, a bridge between what had been separated for so long. The crystal cage around Vorthar began to resonate with the same frequency as the heart, the barriers between them thinning. The darkness within shifted and changed, the corruption that had accrued over eons of imprisonment beginning to fall away like a shell being shed. Eryon felt the divine spark within him responding, growing stronger, more complete. Memories that weren't his own flooded his consciousness, the creation of the worlds, the establishment of the cosmic balance, the first stirrings of the conflict that would lead to the sundering. He saw Eltharion and Vorthar as they once were, not enemies but complementary forces, creation and destruction in perfect harmony. He felt the resentment that had grown as conscious beings feared and shunned destruction while celebrating creation. He understood the spiral that had led to conflict, to corruption, to the desperate measure of the sundering, and he saw the possibility of what could be again. Balance restored, the cycle ended, a new beginning for all existence. The platform beneath them gave way completely as the temporal fold collapsed. But instead of falling, Eryon and his companions found themselves suspended in a sphere of blue-white light emanating from the heart of storms. Outside the sphere, reality itself seemed to be unraveling, the spire dissolving into its component elements. The crystal cage shattered, releasing Vorthar's essence, not as the corrupted darkness it had become, but as something purer, more fundamental. It flowed toward Eryon, drawn by the divine spark and the power of the heart. This is reintegration, the violet-skinned Liara breathed, witnessing what no mortal had seen for millennia. the healing of the original sundering. As Vorthar's essence approached, Eryon felt no fear, only a sense of rightness, of completion. This was what had been missing, what had been separated for too long. The cycle of conflict had been a symptom of that separation, a cosmic wound that had never been allowed to heal. "What happens now?" Dernak asked, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Transformation," Nessa replied, her eyes shifting through colours faster than ever before. "The restoration of what was, the creation of what will be." Vorthar's essence reached Eryon, surrounding him in a cocoon of energy that was neither light nor darkness but something beyond both. The heart of storms pulsed one final time, then dissolved into pure energy that flowed into Eryon's body, merging with both the divine spark and Vorthar's essence. The pain was beyond anything Eryon had experienced, not physical agony but the fundamental restructuring of his very being. He was being unmade and remade simultaneously, his identity both preserved and transformed. In that moment of transformation, as what had been Eryon and what had been Vorthar began to reintegrate into something new, a third presence joined them, familiar, beloved, essential to the balance being restored. Calith, not the echo they had met on the plain, but her true essence, preserved across cycles by her connection to the divine spark. She had always been part of the balance, the bridge between creation and destruction, the harmony that made their opposition productive rather than destructive. "The cycle ends," her voice echoed through the sphere of energy. "But we do not. We transform. We become what we always were meant to be." The sphere of energy expanded suddenly, engulfing not just the platform or the spire, but the entire plain beyond. It swept across Vorthar's army, across the Shadowwood, across the mountains where Iron Deep stood. It continued expanding, crossing boundaries between realms, healing the collapse that had threatened both worlds. Within the heart of that expansion, what had been Eryon, Vorthar and Calith completed their reintegration. The result was neither a single entity nor three separate beings, but a harmony of essences. A restored balance that maintained the distinct qualities of each while creating something greater than the sum of its parts. When the energy finally dissipated, Eryon's companions found themselves standing not on the platform within the spire, but on the plain outside. The spire itself was gone, replaced by a towering tree of crystal that pulsed with light in all colours of the spectrum. And before them stood three figures, recognizable yet transformed. Eryon still bearing his human appearance but with eyes that shifted through all colours of light and shadow. Vorthar, no longer a mass of corrupted darkness but a being of shadow and substance, his form elegant rather than twisted, and between them Calith, her violet skin now bearing patterns of light and shadow that shifted with her movements. Chapter 9. The Price of Power. The crystal tree towered above them, its branches reaching toward the sky like outstretched arms seeking the heavens. Light pulsed through its translucent trunk in rhythmic waves, reminiscent of a heartbeat. Where the black spire had radiated malevolence, this new creation emanated harmony, a physical manifestation of the balance restored. Dernak was the first to find his voice. "By the deep stone," he whispered, his weathered face reflecting the shifting colours from the crystal tree. "What happened? What are you now?" Eryon, or what had once been solely Eryon, stepped forward. His appearance remained largely human, but his eyes cycled through colours like Nessa's, reflecting the spectrum of creation and destruction now balanced within him. "We are reconciled," he said, his voice carrying new resonance, as if multiple tones spoke in perfect harmony. "The sundering has been healed. What was broken has been made whole." Vorthar moved to stand beside him, no longer a formless mass of darkness, but a being of elegant shadow and substance. His form was humanoid yet otherworldly, with skin like polished obsidian that reflected rather than absorbed light. "The cycle is broken," Vorthar added, his voice no longer discordant but complementary to Eryon's. "The endless conflict between creation and destruction has been replaced by cooperation, by balance." Between them stood Calith, more radiant than she had ever been in life. Her violet skin now bore intricate patterns of light and shadow that shifted with her movements, and her silver hair floated around her as if suspended in water. I was the catalyst, she explained, seeing the confusion on their companions' faces. In every cycle, my role was to awaken the divine spark through sacrifice, but I was also the bridge, the connection between opposing forces that made reconciliation possible. The violet-skinned Liara approached cautiously, her ancient eyes wide with wonder. The texts spoke of this possibility, but none believed it could actually happen. Reintegration without destruction of identity, a new form of existence. Not new, Calith corrected gently. Original. This is how it was before the sundering, before resentment and fear drove creation and destruction apart. Rin, ever practical, glanced around at the transformed landscape. The black glass plain was changing before their eyes, cracks spreading across its surface as vegetation pushed through. Not ordinary plants, but crystalline growths that hummed with energy. What about Vorthar's army? He asked. The orcs, the undead, all the forces threatening both worlds. Transformed, Vorthar replied. Those created from corruption have been unmade. Those who chose to serve darkness have been given a choice, acceptance of balance or return to their original state. And the boundaries between worlds? Nessa asked, her eyes shifting colours in rhythm with Eryon's. Healing, Eryon said. Not as separate realms, but as aspects of a single reality. The veil will remain, but as a permeable membrane rather than a barrier. Those ready to see beyond their limited perception will be able to do so. Dernak shook his head, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. So it's over, just like that? Thousands of years of conflict ended in a moment of… what? Forgiveness. Not just forgiveness, Calith said, her voice gentle. Understanding. Recognition of the necessity of both creation and destruction in the proper order of existence. Acceptance that one cannot exist without the other. The crystal tree pulsed more intensely, sending a wave of energy across the landscape. Where it passed, more of the black glass transformed, revealing the natural world beneath the corruption that had covered it for so long. What happens now? Liara asked, directing her question to all three of the transformed beings before her. Eryon, Vorthar and Calith exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Now we rebuild, Eryon said. We restore what was damaged, heal what was wounded, and guide both realms toward a new understanding of balance. There will be resistance, Vorthar added, a hint of his old cynicism colouring his tone. Many will fear change, cling to the old ways, reject the new balance. Which is why we need allies, Calith concluded. Those who witnessed the transformation, who understand what has occurred. You four will be essential in the days to come. Nessa laughed softly. 4 temporal anomalies aren't enough. I would think your combined power could reshape reality as you see fit. We could, Eryon acknowledged, but that would be imposition, not acceptance. True balance cannot be forced. It must be chosen, embraced willingly. Besides, Calith added with a smile that reminded them of her mortal self, power without wisdom is merely force, and force without compassion leads back to the very imbalance we've just healed. Dernak stroked his beard thoughtfully. So you want us to be, what, ambassadors? Missionaries spreading the good word of cosmic balance? Witnesses, Vorthar corrected. Those who can speak truth because they have seen it with their own eyes. The world will change whether mortals accept it or not, but understanding eases transition. A distant rumble drew their attention to the horizon, where storm clouds gathered. Not natural weather, but the collision of energies as the restored balance rippled outward, encountering pockets of resistance. Iron deep, Rin said suddenly. Tharok and the others, they need to know what's happened. They already sense it, Liara assured him. The divine energy has touched every corner of both realms, but you're right. They deserve a more complete explanation. Eryon nodded. We will accompany you there. It's time to gather our allies, to prepare for what comes next. Which is, Dernak prompted. Renewal, Calith said simply. The beginning of a new age, neither fully light nor dark, but balanced between creation and destruction, life and death, beginning and ending. The crystal tree's light pulsed once more, and a path formed before them, not of blue energy as the Guardians had been, but of living crystal that grew from the transforming plane. It stretched toward the distant mountains where Iron Deep lay hidden. "The way is open," Vorthar said, gesturing toward the path. "Shall we begin?" As they set off along the crystal path, Eryon felt a profound sense of peace unlike anything he had experienced before. The rage that had driven him for so long was gone, replaced by understanding. The divine spark that had once been a burden was now integrated fully into his being, neither controlling nor controlled, but existing in harmony with his mortal essence. Beside him walked Calith, restored not just to life but to her true purpose. Their fingers intertwined, light and shadow dancing where they touched. "You knew," he said quietly. "From the beginning you knew this was possible." She smiled, violet eyes reflecting the spectrum of the crystal path. "I hoped. Through countless cycles I carried that hope, that one incarnation would choose healing over vengeance, reconciliation over conflict. Why me? What made this cycle different? You asked questions no previous Eltharian had asked. You doubted when others accepted. You sought understanding when others sought only victory." Her expression softened with affection. "And perhaps most importantly, you loved deeply enough to place my fate above your vengeance." Behind them, Vorthar moved with newfound grace, his shadow form no longer a corruption, but a natural counterpoint to light. He had been silent since they began their journey, observing the transformation of the landscape with what might have been wonder. "And you?" Eryon asked him. "After eons of imprisonment and conflict, how does it feel to be reconciled?" Vorthar considered the question. "Like waking from a nightmare to find the world more vibrant than remembered. The corruption clouded everything. Purpose, perception, possibility. Now I see clearly again." "Will others understand?" Calith wondered aloud. "Those who have known only conflict, who have suffered under the corruption." "Some will," Eryon replied. "Others will need time. The cycle didn't break in a single moment. It won't be rebuilt in one either." As they walked, the landscape continued to transform around them. The crystal path extended before them, growing like a living thing. Above, the sky cleared of the unnatural storm clouds, revealing a sunset unlike any they had seen before. Colours bleeding into one another in impossible combinations. Beauty born from the marriage of light and darkness. Nessa moved to walk beside them, her temporal anomaly nature resonating with their transformed state. "The timelines are stabilizing," she reported, "converging toward a single flow rather than fragmenting. Whatever you did in there, it's affecting more than just the present moment. The sundering fractured more than just Eltharion and Vorthar," Calith explained. "It created splinters in reality itself, alternate paths, possible futures that could never fully manifest. Now those fragments are being drawn back together." "Like us," Eryon added, glancing at his companions. "Separate pieces finding wholeness in unity." They continued toward IR, on deep, each lost in their own thoughts about what had occurred and what was yet to come. The transformation had only begun, both within themselves and in the world around them. The price of power had been paid not through destruction but through surrender, through the willingness to become something new. As night fell, the crystal path began to glow with inner light, illuminating their way forward. Stars appeared overhead, brighter and more numerous than before, as if the very cosmos celebrated the restoration of balance. Eryon looked up at them, recognizing patterns he had never seen before, constellations from before the sundering, when the night sky reflected the harmony of creation and destruction rather than their conflict. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Calith said, following his gaze. "Yes," he agreed, "and worth every sacrifice." The path stretched before them, leading not just to Iron Deep but to a future none of them could fully envision, a world transformed by balance restored, by the price of power willingly paid. Chapter 10. The Final Battle. Iron Deep was in chaos when they arrived, not from attack, but from transformation. The mountain itself was changing, crystal formations growing from its stone walls, pulsing with the same rhythmic light as the tree that had replaced the black spire. Dwarves, elves, and humans gathered in confused clusters, weapons drawn but uncertain what enemy they faced. Commander Tharok stood at the main entrance, his warhammer raised defensively as the crystal path approached his position. When he recognized the figures walking upon it, His weathered face registered shock, then disbelief. "Durnak! Rin! Liara!" he called out. "What in the deep hells is happening, and who or what are those with you?" The violet-skinned Liara stepped forward. "Lower your weapons, Commander. The war is over. The cycle is broken." "Broken?" Tharok repeated skeptically. "Nothing breaks a war but victory or defeat. Which is this?" "Neither," Eryon said, approaching with Calith and Vorthar flanking him. "It's reconciliation." Recognition dawned slowly on Tharok's face as he studied Eryon's transformed appearance. "Altharion? Is that still you in there, boy?" "Part of me," Eryon acknowledged with a smile, "along with much more. The divine spark has been reunited with what was sundered from it. Balance has been restored." Tharok's gaze shifted to Vorthar, his grip tightening on his warhammer. "And that? That looks suspiciously like the enemy we've been fighting." "Because he was," Calith confirmed, "but no longer. What you see is Vorthar restored to his original purpose, necessary destruction in balance with creation, not the corrupted force that threatened both realms." The dwarf commander shook his head in disbelief. "You expect me to accept that our ancient enemy is now our ally? Just like that?" "Not just like that," Vorthar said, his voice carrying none of the malevolence that had characterized him for eons. "Through understanding, through recognition of the damage caused by imbalance, through choice." More resistance fighters had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Among them was the first Liara, who pushed through the crowd to stand beside Tharok. Her eyes widened as she beheld her violet-skinned counterpart and the three transformed beings. "It's true," she breathed, her ancient eyes filling with tears. "Reintegration. After all these millennia." "You believe this?" Tharok demanded, turning to her in surprise. "I feel it," she replied, placing a hand over her heart. "The balance that was lost has returned. The wound in reality is healing." From within Iron Deep came sounds of confusion and wonder as the transformation continued. Crystal formations grew along the walls, not destroying the dwarven craftsmanship but enhancing it, adding new dimensions of beauty to the ancient halls. "Your mountain is not being harmed," Eryon assured Tharok. "It's being elevated, becoming a nexus point where the restored balance manifests most strongly." "And my people?" the dwarf demanded. "What happens to them in this new, balanced world of yours?" "They continue," Calith said gently. "They live, they create, they eventually return to the cycle of existence, but now they do so in harmony with the true nature of reality, not in conflict with it." Tharok studied the three transformed beings, his practical dwarven mind struggling with concepts beyond normal comprehension. Finally, he lowered his warhammer. "I've trusted you this far, Altharion, or whatever you are now. I suppose I can trust you a bit further." He turned to the gathered fighters. "Stand down. These are allies, not enemies." The tension eased slightly, though many still regarded Vorthar with suspicion. Centuries of conflict could not be erased in a moment, regardless of transformation. "We should gather the council," the first Liara suggested. "All must hear what has occurred, what it means for our future." Tharok nodded in agreement. "The Great Forge can accommodate everyone. It's already changing." He gestured to the crystal formations that had begun to grow there. As they moved deeper into Iron Deep, Eryon sensed the ripples of transformation spreading outward from their presence. The divine energy of reintegration touched everything, revealing the underlying connections between all aspects of existence. The Great Forge had indeed changed dramatically. The massive furnaces now burned with multicolored flames that required no fuel. The anvils gleamed with an inner light, and the ceiling had transformed into a crystalline dome that somehow reflected the night sky above the mountain. Resistance fighters, healers, and refugees gathered in a wide circle, their faces showing varying degrees of fear, wonder, and confusion. At the center stood the three transformed beings, with Durnak, Rin, Nessa, and the two Liaras forming a smaller circle around them. "Many of you know me as Eryon Matthews," Eryon began, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the vast chamber. "Others know me as Altharion, the Chosen One, vessel of the divine spark. What stands before you now is both and neither, a reconciliation of what was sundered long ago. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some made warding gestures while others leaned forward in fascination. The enemy you have fought for generations was once part of the cosmic balance, Eryon continued, gesturing to Vorthar. Necessary destruction to complement creation, death to balance life, ending to counter beginning. When that balance was broken, corruption followed, on both sides. The cycle of conflict you have experienced, the rising of Vorthar's forces, the awakening of Altharion, the temporary victory followed by eventual return, was a symptom of that broken balance, Calith added. A wound in reality that could never fully heal because the treatment addressed the symptoms, not the cause. "So you surrendered?" called a voice from the crowd, a human fighter with fresh scars across his face. "After all we've sacrificed, you just made peace with the monster that killed our families." "Not surrender," Vorthar replied, his voice calm despite the accusation. "Reconciliation. Recognition that continued conflict served neither side, that the corruption had twisted both creation and destruction from their true purposes." "Pretty words from the architect of genocide," the fighter spat. "Why should we believe anything you say?" Before Vorthar could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. Not the gentle vibration of transformation, but a violent shaking that sent cracks racing across the crystal dome overhead. "What's happening?" Tharok demanded, regaining his balance as the tremor subsided. The two Liaras exchanged alarmed glances. "Resistance!" the violet-skinned one said grimly. "The transformation has encountered opposition." "What kind of opposition?" Rin asked. "I thought Vorthar's forces were either transformed or disbanded." "Not external opposition," Eryon explained, his expression grave. "Internal, parts of reality itself rejecting the restoration of balance." Another tremor shook the mountain, stronger than the first. Crystal formations shattered, raining fragments onto the gathered crowd. The multicolored flames in the furnaces flared dangerously high. "The corruption was not confined to Vorthar or his forces," Calith explained urgently. "It infected reality itself, creating pockets of pure chaos that exist solely to perpetuate imbalance. These pockets are now fighting back against the transformation." "So the war isn't over," Tharok concluded, retrieving his warhammer. "It's just changed battlefields." "In a sense," Vorthar acknowledged. "But this battle cannot be won with conventional weapons or tactics. It requires the direct application of balanced power, creation and destruction working in harmony." The mountain shook again, and this time a section of the wall collapsed entirely, revealing not the expected stone behind it, but a swirling vortex of chaotic energy. From within that vortex emerged creatures unlike any they had faced before. Not orcs or undead or even voidwalkers, but amalgamations of matter and energy that constantly shifted form, their only consistent feature being eyes that burned with malevolent purpose. "Chaos manifestations!" the first Liara gasped. "I've only read about them in the oldest texts, physical embodiments of imbalance itself." The creatures surged forward, their touch causing anything they contacted to distort and warp. Fighters who attempted to engage them found their weapons melting, their armor twisting into impossible shapes. "Fall back," Tharok ordered. "Conventional weapons are useless." Eryon, Calith and Vorthar moved to the front, forming a line between the chaos manifestations and the retreating fighters. Power gathered around them, not the pure light of creation or the pure darkness of destruction, but a harmonious blend of both. "This is our battle," Eryon said, his eyes cycling through colors more rapidly. "The final confrontation between balance and chaos. Not yours alone," came Nessa's voice as she stepped up beside them. "Temporal anomalies have their uses in stabilizing reality." The two Liaras joined them, ancient magic flowing from their hands. "We stand with you," the violet-skinned one declared, "as we have through countless cycles." Durnak hefted his warhammer, which had begun to glow with the same light as the crystal formations. "My weapon's changed," he observed with surprise. "Seems it wants to be useful after all." Rin appeared beside him, his scout's daggers similarly transformed. "Looks like we're all in this together." The chaos manifestations paused, as if assessing this unexpected resistance. Then, with a sound like reality tearing, They attacked en masse. Eryon, Calith, and Vorthar moved in perfect synchronization, their powers blending into a wave of balanced energy that met the chaotic assault head-on. Where the energies collided, reality itself seemed to waver, possibilities flickering in and out of existence. Nessa darted between manifestations, her temporal anomaly nature allowing her to disrupt their unstable forms. The two Lyaras worked in tandem, their magic creating zones of stability that prevented the chaos from spreading further into Iron Deep. Dernak and Rin discovered that their transformed weapons could indeed affect the manifestations, each strike causing the chaotic entities to temporarily stabilize, becoming vulnerable to conventional attacks. "Target the stable ones!" Dernak shouted to the fighters who had regained their courage. "Hit them when they solidify!" The battle raged across the Great Forge, chaos and balance locked in a struggle that transcended physical combat. Each victory against a manifestation sent ripples of stability through reality, while each setback allowed chaos to gain ground. Eryon found himself drawing on aspects of both creation and destruction, weaving them together in ways that would have been impossible before reintegration. Beside him, Calith served as the conduit, the bridge that allowed opposing forces to work in harmony. Vorthar provided the counterpoint, the necessary destruction that prevented creation from becoming stagnant. "They keep coming!" Rin called out, dispatching another manifestation only to see 3 more emerge from the vortex. "There's no end to them." The vortex, the violet-skinned Liara realized. It's a tear in reality, a direct connection to the pockets of chaos. We need to seal it. "How?" Tharok demanded, joining the fight with his own weapon, which had begun to glow like Dernak's. "The same way the Sundering was healed," Calith replied. "Through willing sacrifice, through the surrender of separation in favor of unity." Understanding passed between Eryon, Calith, and Vorthar without words. They moved toward the vortex, their combined power intensifying with each step. "What are you doing?" Dernak called after them. "What must be done," Eryon replied. "Stand ready. Reality will fluctuate when the tear is sealed." The 3 transformed beings reached the swirling vortex, positioning themselves around its perimeter. The chaos manifestations seemed to sense their intention, abandoning other targets to converge on this new threat. "Now!" Eryon commanded. As one, they plunged their hands into the vortex, channeling the full power of balanced creation and destruction into the tear in reality. Light and darkness intertwined, neither dominating but both essential to the healing. The vortex began to contract, its chaotic energies stabilizing under the influence of balance restored. The manifestations caught in the process dissolved, their components returning to the natural order. But the strain on the 3 beings was enormous. Maintaining perfect balance while healing such profound damage required more than power. It demanded complete surrender of individual identity in favor of unified purpose. "They're fading," Nessa cried out in alarm, seeing the forms of Eryon, Calith, and Vorthar becoming translucent as more of their essence poured into the healing. "No," the first Liara corrected, her ancient eyes seeing beyond physical appearance. "They're transcending, moving beyond form to heal reality at its most fundamental level." The vortex collapsed with a sound like a massive bell being struck, sending a shockwave of balanced energy throughout Iron Deep and beyond. Where it passed, chaos receded, stability returned, and the transformation resumed its natural progression. When the light faded, the 3 figures stood changed once more, still recognizable, but now bearing the unmistakable mark of their sacrifice, a luminescence that seemed to emanate from within rather than reflect from without. "It is done," Eryon said, his voice resonating with new depth. "The tear is sealed, the chaos contained." "At what cost?" Dernak asked, approaching cautiously. "You look different." "We have given more of ourselves to the balance," Calith explained. "Surrendered more of our separate identities to the unified whole." "The final battle was never meant to be fought with weapons," Vorthar added, "but with willingness to sacrifice separation for unity, individuality for harmony." Around them, Iron Deep continued its transformation, but more gently now, without the violent tremors that had accompanied the chaos manifestations. The crystal formations stabilized, becoming permanent features of the mountain rather than invasive growths. Tharok surveyed the changed Great Forge, his practical nature already assessing how to adapt to these new circumstances. So it truly is over? No more enemies to fight, no more battles to win? The great conflict is resolved, Eryon confirmed. But challenges remain. Balance must be maintained, not just established. The world must learn to live in harmony with its true nature, not in denial of it. And that's where we come in, Rin surmised. The witnesses, the ambassadors, the guides for those who don't understand what's happened. Precisely, Calith said with a smile. The transformation will continue to spread, touching every corner of both realms. Some will embrace it, others will resist. All will need guidance to navigate this new reality. The first Liara approached her violet-skinned counterpart. What of us? Two versions of the same being, existing simultaneously. Like all aspects of the sundered reality, you will find your own path to reconciliation, Vorthar replied. Not through loss of identity, but through recognition of shared purpose. As if in response to his words, the two Liaras began to glow with the same light that emanated from the three transformed beings. They reached for each other, not merging but connecting, becoming distinct expressions of a unified essence. I understand now, they said in unison, their voices harmonizing perfectly. Separate but connected, individual but unified. Nessa watched with fascination, her eyes shifting through colors more rapidly than ever. The timelines are stabilizing completely, she reported. The fragmentation is healing. I can feel my own nature changing, becoming more anchored. Throughout Iron Deep, similar transformations were occurring as the full impact of balance restored rippled through reality. Dwarves found their connection to stone deepened, elves their bond with natural energy enhanced, humans their adaptability and creativity amplified. What happens now? Tharok asked, watching his people embrace their transformed nature with growing acceptance. Now, Eryon said, we rebuild, we teach, we guide, we help both worlds understand the gift they've been given, not just peace but harmony, not just an end to conflict, but a beginning of true cooperation between all aspects of existence. Outside Iron Deep, the night sky blazed with unprecedented brilliance as stars long hidden by the veil between worlds became visible once more. The crystal tree that had replaced the black spire pulsed in rhythm with them, a beacon of balance visible across both realms. The final battle had been fought not with weapons, but with willingness to change, to sacrifice, to embrace a truth larger than individual desire. And in that surrender, victory had been found. Not over an enemy, but over the cycle of conflict itself. Balance had been restored. The cycle was broken. And though challenges remained, the path forward was clear. Not a war path of vengeance, but a journey of reconciliation, of healing, of harmony between all aspects of existence. Chapter 11. The Ultimate Sacrifice. Dawn broke over a transformed world. From the highest peak of Iron Deep, Eryon stood with Calith and Vorthar, watching as light spilled across the landscape below. The black glass plain had completely transformed overnight, becoming a vast crystalline meadow where formations of living crystal grew alongside ordinary plants in perfect harmony. In the distance, the crystal tree that had replaced the black spire towered above everything, its branches extending into the sky like a bridge between earth and heaven. Light pulsed through it in rhythm with the heartbeat of reality itself, the balanced flow of creation and destruction working in concert rather than opposition. Beautiful, Calith murmured, her transformed being resonating with the harmony spread before them. And fragile, Vorthar added, his once cynical nature now tempered with wisdom rather than bitterness. Balance established is not balance maintained. The work has only begun. Eryon nodded in agreement. The transformation spreads, but understanding lags behind. Many will fear what they don't comprehend, resist what they can't control. Below them, activity buzzed throughout Iron Deep as its inhabitants adapted to their changed environment. The dwarves, practical as always, had already begun incorporating the crystal formations into their architecture and craftsmanship. The elves meditated upon the new energies flowing through the mountain, seeking to understand their nature and purpose. The humans, adaptable as ever, found ways to utilize the transformation for immediate needs, healing the wounded, strengthening structures, enhancing weapons and abilities. They learn quickly, Calith observed with approval. These are the willing ones, Vorthar reminded her. Those who witnessed the transformation directly, who had already committed themselves to fighting imbalance, even if they didn't understand it fully. The greater challenge lies beyond, Eryon agreed. In the human cities where the veil is only now beginning to thin, in the elven enclaves that have isolated themselves for centuries, in the dwarven kingdoms that remain sealed beneath the earth. A presence approached from behind. Nessa, her temporal anomaly nature now stabilized into something new. She no longer shifted involuntarily between moments, but seemed to exist in all of them simultaneously, her perception encompassing past, present, and potential futures. The ripples reach farther than you might think, she reported, joining them at the peak. I can sense the transformation touching distant places, awakening awareness in those who were blind to the true nature of reality. And the resistance? Vorthar asked. Present but diminishing, Nessa replied. The pockets of chaos we encountered yesterday were the strongest manifestations. What remains is more subtle. Doubt, fear, attachment to the old ways. Those cannot be overcome with power, Calith said softly. Only with patience, with understanding, with compassion for the difficulty of change. Eryon turned from the vista to face his companions. Which is why we must separate. The statement hung in the air, unexpected despite its obvious necessity. The three transformed beings had existed in such perfect harmony since reintegration that the thought of separation seemed almost sacrilegious. Not division, Eryon clarified, sensing their concern, but distribution, our unified essence maintaining connection while our individual expressions travel where needed most. The human realm, Calith surmised. The elven enclaves, the deep kingdoms of the dwarves. And the spaces between, Vorthar added. The borderlands where transformation will be most chaotic, where guidance will be most needed. Nessa studied them with her multifaceted perception. You can maintain unity across such distances. The strain would be considerable. We are no longer bound by physical limitations, Eryon explained. The sacrifice we made to seal the chaos vortex elevated our nature beyond form. We remain connected regardless of apparent separation. When will you go? Nessa asked. Today, Calith replied. The transformation accelerates with each passing hour. We must be present at key nexus points to ensure it proceeds in harmony rather than discord. Nessa nodded in understanding. I'll inform the others. They should hear this from you directly before you depart. As she left to gather the resistance leaders, Eryon, Calith, and Vorthar shared a moment of silent communion. Not communication through words, but the direct sharing of essence that had become natural to their transformed state. In that communion, they acknowledged what none had spoken aloud, that the separation, while necessary, would diminish each of them. The perfect balance they maintained together would be challenged by distance, by the distinct challenges each would face, by the very nature of individual expression. It was, in its way, another sacrifice, not as dramatic as their confrontation with the chaos vortex, but perhaps more difficult for being subtle, extended, uncertain in its duration. When they descended to the Great Forge, they found the resistance leaders gathered, Tharok, Dernak, Rin, the harmonized Liaras, and representatives from each race and faction that had fought against Vorthar's forces. You're leaving, Tharok said bluntly as they entered, his dwarven perception having grown sharp enough to read their intention. Distributing, Eryon corrected gently. The transformation requires guidance in many places simultaneously. We cannot be everywhere at once, even in our current state. So you'll separate, Dernak concluded, after everything it took to bring you together. Not separation as you understand it, Calith explained. Our essence remains unified even as our expressions diverge. Think of it as different hands of the same being, reaching out to touch what needs healing. The harmonized Liaras stepped forward, their movements perfectly synchronized despite maintaining distinct physical forms. We understand, they said in unison. It is necessary, though difficult. Where will you go? Rin asked practically. I will journey to the human cities, Eryon replied, beginning with Eastridge, where the veil thins most rapidly. Humans will struggle most with the transformation, having been most thoroughly separated from awareness of the other realm. I will return to the elven enclaves, Calith said. My people have isolated themselves for too long, using magic to maintain separation rather than connection. They must be guided toward integration rather than continued isolation. And I, Vorthar added, will travel the borderlands, the spaces between established realms where chaos and order meet most directly. There, the transformation will be most volatile, most in need of balanced influence. Tharok frowned, his practical mind still struggling with concepts beyond normal comprehension. And what of us? What role do we play in this new world of yours? The most important role of all, Eryon replied. You are the bridge between old and new, between what was and what is becoming. You understand both the conflict that was and the harmony that could be. You want us to be teachers, Durnak realized. Guides, Calith corrected. Those who walk beside others on the path of transformation, not those who dictate the journey. Some will resist, Vorthar warned. Some will cling to the old ways, the old conflicts, the old identities that gave their lives meaning. They will need patience more than power, understanding more than enlightenment. The resistance leaders exchanged glances, measuring themselves against this new challenge. They had been warriors, fighters, defenders against a tangible enemy. Now they were asked to become something else entirely, mentors in a transformation they themselves barely understood. I don't know if we're qualified for this, Rin said, voicing what many were thinking. We're soldiers, not philosophers. How do we guide others through something we're still trying to comprehend ourselves? By being honest about that very struggle, Eryon replied. Your value lies not in perfect understanding, but in willingness to embrace change, to walk the path of transformation openly, vulnerably, authentically. Your questions are as valuable as any answers you might offer, Calith added, for they create space for discovery rather than imposing certainty. The harmonized Liaras nodded in agreement. We have lived countless cycles, witnessed the pattern repeat endlessly, yet only now do we truly understand its purpose, not as conflict to be won, but as imbalance to be healed. Tharok stroked his beard thoughtfully. So we stay here? Make Iron Deep the center of this transformation? A center, not the center, Vorthar corrected. The transformation has many nexus points, many places where the veil thins most rapidly. Iron Deep is one such place, but not the only one. Some should remain here, Eryon agreed. Others should travel to places where guidance is needed most. The crystal paths will facilitate such journeys, allowing you to move between realms more easily than before. Durnak hefted his transformed warhammer, studying the crystalline patterns that now adorned its surface. And if we encounter resistance, not just questions or fear, but active opposition, you defend without destroying, Calith said firmly. You protect without punishing. You remember always that opposition stems from fear, and fear from lack of understanding. A difficult balance to maintain in the heat of conflict, Tharok observed dryly. All worthwhile balances are difficult, Vorthar replied. That is why they require conscious choice, moment by moment. The discussion continued as practical matters were addressed. How to distribute resources, establish communication across distances, identify those most receptive to guidance and those most likely to resist. Throughout it all, Eryon, Calith and Vorthar maintained their perfect harmony, their unified essence informing each response while their individual expressions provided different perspectives. As the meeting concluded, the three transformed beings prepared for their departure. They moved to the center of the Great Forge, where the crystal formations converged in a pattern reminiscent of the tree that had replaced the Black Spire. Before we distribute, Eryon announced, there is one final gift we wish to share. The three joined hands, forming a circle. Power gathered around them, not the raw energy of their previous manifestations, but something subtler, more refined, more deeply connected to the fabric of reality itself. What we offer is not power as you have understood it, Calith explained, not strength to dominate or force to overcome. What we offer is perception, Vorthar continued, the ability to see beyond separation, to to recognize connection even where it appears absent. To receive this gift is to accept responsibility, Eryon concluded. For once you perceive the true nature of reality, you cannot return to comfortable ignorance. You must live in accordance with that perception, even when doing so challenges everything you once believed. The gathered leaders exchanged glances, silently measuring their readiness for such a gift. One by one they stepped forward. First the harmonized Liaras, then Nessa, then Durnak and Rin together, and finally Tharok, his practical nature requiring the most consideration before acceptance. As each approached, the three transformed beings extended their free hands, creating a second circle that encompassed the first. Where the circles intersected, light and shadow danced together in perfect harmony, neither dominating but both essential. "Receive what we freely give," the three said in unison. "See what has always been present but hidden from perception. Know the truth that lies beneath all appearance." The energy flowed outward, touching each recipient in turn. There was no dramatic flash, no overwhelming surge of power, only a subtle shift in perception, as if veils were being gently lifted one by one. The harmonized Liaras were the first to respond, their ancient eyes widening in wonder. "We see," they breathed, "truly see for the first time in countless cycles." Nessa's temporal perception expanded further, encompassing not just the flow of time but its relationship to space, energy, matter, the interconnected web of existence that transcended linear progression. Durnak and Rin gasped in unison, their perceptions suddenly extending beyond physical form to the essence that animated all things. They saw each other not just as bodies, but as patterns of energy, as expressions of the same fundamental reality that manifested in infinite diversity. Tharok was the last to respond, his practical nature requiring the most adjustment to this expanded perception. When it finally integrated, he simply nodded, as if confirming something he had long suspected, but never been able to articulate. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "And nothing," Calith replied with a gentle smile. "The world remains as it always was. Only your perception of it has transformed. Use this gift wisely," Vorthar advised. "Share it judiciously with those ready to receive. For some, such perception would overwhelm rather than enlighten. Trust your intuition," Eryon added. "You will know who is prepared, who needs more time, who requires different paths to understanding." With the gift bestowed, the three transformed beings prepared for their distribution. They maintained their circle, but now energy flowed inward rather than outward, concentrating at their center until it formed a nexus of pure potential. "Though we appear to separate, we remain connected," Eryon reminded them. "What one experiences, all share. What one learns, all know." "Call upon us if need arises," Calith instructed. "Not through ritual or invocation, but through intention aligned with balance. We will hear, we will respond. And remember," Vorthar concluded, "that the transformation has only begun. What comes next depends not on our guidance alone, but on the choices made by all who witness and participate in this new reality." The energy at the center of their circle intensified, becoming a miniature version of the crystal tree, a perfect embodiment of balance restored. As it reached its peak, the three transformed beings seemed to dissolve into it, their physical forms becoming patterns of light and shadow that flowed along the branches before separating in three distinct directions. Eryon's essence streamed westward, toward the human cities where the veil had been thickest, where understanding would be most challenging. Calith's essence flowed eastward, toward the ancient elven enclaves hidden in forests that had stood since before the sundering. Vorthar's essence descended, seeking the borderlands where realms intersected, where chaos and order met in creative tension. In the Great Forge, only the miniature crystal tree remained, pulsing with the same rhythm as its larger counterpart that had replaced the Black Spire. It stood as a physical reminder of the connection maintained across distance, of unity preserved despite apparent separation. The gathered leaders stood in silence, their expanded perception allowing them to follow the distributed essences far longer than ordinary sight would permit. They watched until the last traces disappeared beyond the horizon, beyond the boundaries of conventional space and time. And so it begins, Tharok said finally. The real work. The healing, the harmonized Liaras corrected. The reconciliation of what was sundered so long ago. The ultimate sacrifice, Nessa added softly. Not death, but distribution. Not ending, but expansion. Outside Iron Deep, the transformed world continued its evolution. Crystal formations grew alongside natural vegetation, creating ecosystems that embodied the new balance. Animals adapted to the changed environment, developing new abilities, new awareness, new relationships with their surroundings. And throughout both realms, beings of all kinds awakened to a reality they had always inhabited but never fully perceived. A reality where creation and destruction worked in harmony rather than opposition, where life and death were not enemies but partners in an eternal dance, where beginning and ending were recognized as different expressions of the same fundamental process. The cycle was broken, the balance was restored. The ultimate sacrifice had been made, not through destruction but through distribution, not through loss but through expansion, not through ending but through transformation that encompassed all without diminishing any. And though challenges remained, though resistance would arise, though the path forward would not always be clear or easy, the foundation had been laid for a new way of being, a way that honored the truth of existence rather than denying it, that embraced wholeness rather than clinging to separation, that recognized the essential unity underlying all apparent diversity. The Chosen One's wrath had been transformed into wisdom. The Dark God's corruption had been healed into necessary destruction. The Catalyst's sacrifice had become the bridge between opposing forces. Together, they had broken the cycle. Together, they had restored the balance. Together, they had made the ultimate sacrifice, not of life, but of limitation. Not of existence, but of separation. Not of identity, but of isolation. And in that sacrifice they had found not ending but beginning, not loss but expansion, not death but transformation into something greater than any could have become alone. The dawn of a new age had truly begun. Epilogue. Echoes of Balance. 1 year later, Dernak stood at the edge of what had once been the black glass plain, marveling at the transformation that continued to unfold before him. The crystalline meadow now extended as far as the eye could see, a perfect blend of natural vegetation and living crystal that pulsed with the rhythm of balanced reality. At the center, the crystal tree that had replaced the black spire had grown even larger, its branches now extending so high that they seemed to touch the stars themselves. Light flowed constantly through its translucent trunk, cycling through patterns that reflected the harmonious interaction of creation and destruction. "Still hard to believe," came a voice from behind him. Rin approached, his scout's gear now adorned with the same crystalline patterns that marked all who had received the gift of expanded perception. "Which part?" Dernak asked with a wry smile. "That we're not fighting for our lives? That the enemy is now our ally? Or that reality itself has been fundamentally transformed?" "All of it," Rin admitted, coming to stand beside his friend. "Sometimes I wake up expecting to find it was all a dream, that we're still in the old cycle, still preparing for the next battle against Vorthar's forces. And instead, you find yourself teaching others how to perceive beyond separation," Dernak concluded. "How to live in harmony with a reality they never knew existed." "It's harder than fighting," Rin said with a sigh. "At least in battle you know who the enemy is, what victory looks like. This transformation, it has no endpoint, no clear measure of success. That's because it's not a battle to be won," came another voice, one of the harmonized Liaras, approaching from the direction of Iron Deep. "It's a process to be experienced, a journey without destination." The ancient elf joined them at the edge of the crystalline meadow, her eyes reflecting the patterns of light that flowed through the landscape. Like all who had received the gift of expanded perception, she had changed over the past year, not just in appearance with the crystalline patterns that adorned her skin, but in essence with a depth of awareness that transcended ordinary consciousness. "Any word from them?" Dernak asked, not needing to specify who he meant. The Liara nodded. "Echoes primarily, impressions rather than direct communication. They remain distributed, their work far from complete. Eryon has established a nexus in Eastridge, she continued. The humans struggle most with the transformation, their perception having been most thoroughly limited by the veil, but progress comes, slowly but steadily. And Calith? Rin inquired. The elven enclaves resist in their own way, Liara replied. Not through denial, but through attempt to control, to direct the transformation according to ancient prophecies and expectations. She guides them toward acceptance rather than manipulation. And Vorthar? Dernak asked, still finding it strange to speak the name without hatred. The borderlands flourish under his influence, Liara said with a smile. What were once places of conflict, of collision between realms, have become nexus points of creative potential. New forms emerge there, new possibilities that could not have existed in either realm alone. They stood in silence for a moment, each reflecting on the year that had passed since the ultimate sacrifice, since the three transformed beings had distributed their essence across both realms to guide the ongoing transformation. Do you think they'll ever return? Rin asked finally. Reunite as they were before? I don't know, Liara admitted. The distribution was necessary for the transformation to proceed harmoniously. Whether reunification will become possible or necessary, only time will tell. They remain connected, Dernak reminded them. What one experiences, all share. What one learns, all know. They are separated in expression but unified in essence. Much like reality itself, Liara observed. Infinite diversity emerging from fundamental unity. The many arising from the one, yet never truly separate from it. Their conversation was interrupted by a pulse of light from the crystal tree, stronger than the usual rhythm, bright enough to illuminate the entire meadow, as if it were day rather than dusk. The pulse spread outward in concentric circles, touching everything in its path with renewed energy. What was that? Rin asked, his hand instinctively moving to his transformed dagger. A message, Liara replied, her expanded perception allowing her to interpret the pulse, or perhaps more accurately, a reminder. Of what? Dernak prompted. That the work continues, she said simply. That balance established must be balance maintained. That transformation is not a single event but an ongoing process. As if in response to her words, the crystal formations around them began to shift, rearranging themselves into new patterns that reflected the evolving nature of reality itself. What had seemed stable, fixed, completed was revealing itself to be dynamic, fluid, continuously becoming. It will never be finished, will it? Rin realized. There is no endpoint, no final state of perfect balance. Balance is not a state but a process, Liara confirmed. Not a destination but a journey. Not something achieved once and for all but something chosen moment by moment. Dernak nodded slowly, his practical dwarven mind having expanded over the past year to encompass concepts that would once have seemed incomprehensible. So the ultimate sacrifice wasn't just distribution, was it? It was the willingness to engage in endless transformation, to guide a process with no conclusion. Now you understand, Liara said with approval. What Eryon, Calith and Vorthar undertook was not a finite task, but an infinite commitment, not a battle with victory at its end, but a journey with no end at all. And our role in all this? Rin asked. Are we also committed to an endless process? All existence is an endless process, Liara replied. The difference lies in awareness, in conscious participation rather than unconscious reaction. The gift they gave us was not power but perception, the ability to see and engage with reality as it truly is, not as we wish or fear it to be. Another pulse emanated from the crystal tree, gentler than the first but no less significant. This time, it carried not just energy but images, glimpses of the transformation as it unfolded across both realms. They saw Eryon in Eastridge, guiding humans through their first experiences of expanded perception, helping them navigate the disorientation that came with seeing beyond the veil that had limited their awareness for so long. They saw Calith in the ancient elven enclave of Silvermoon, working with elders who struggled to reconcile the transformation with prophecies that had guided their people for millennia, showing them how attachment to prediction limited their ability to embrace the present reality. They saw Vorthar in the borderlands, where chaos and order met in creative tension, nurturing new forms that embodied the balance in ways neither realm could have produced alone. Hybrid creatures, novel ecosystems, unprecedented manifestations of consciousness. They remain connected to us, Dernak realized, not just to each other but to all who received their gift. Connection is the fundamental nature of reality, Liara confirmed. Separation is the illusion that the sundering created, that the cycle perpetuated, that the transformation now heals. As the images faded, the three stood in contemplative silence, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky, stars that had always been present but had become visible only after the veil thinned, after perception expanded, after balance began to be restored. "So we continue," Rin said finally, "teaching, guiding, witnessing the transformation as it unfolds, and participating in it," Dernak added, "not just observing but engaging, contributing our unique perspectives to the process." "That is our role," Liara agreed, "not to direct or control but to facilitate and support, not to impose understanding but to create space for discovery." As night fell completely, the crystalline meadow began to glow with its own inner light, not the harsh illumination of the black glass plane it had replaced, but a gentle radiance that embodied the harmony of creation and destruction working in concert. In that light, the three figures made their way back toward Iron Deep, where others waited, others who had received the gift of expanded perception, who had committed themselves to guiding the transformation, who had accepted the endless journey of balance maintained rather than balance achieved. Behind them, the crystal tree pulsed with the rhythm of reality itself, creation and destruction, beginning and ending, light and shadow dancing together in perfect harmony. Not static but dynamic, no. T-fixed but flowing, not completed but continuously becoming. The cycle was broken, the balance was restored, the transformation continued. And though the Chosen One, the Dark God and the Catalyst remained distributed across both realms, their essence unified despite apparent separation, their sacrifice ongoing rather than completed, their commitment infinite rather than finite, they were not absent but present in every pulse of the crystal tree, in every new formation that emerged from the transformed landscape, in every being whose perception expanded to encompass the true nature of reality. The ultimate sacrifice had not been an ending, but a beginning. Not a conclusion, but an invitation. Not a final victory, but the first step in an endless journey toward harmony between all aspects of existence. And in that journey, there was not perfection but process, not completion but continuation, not arrival but eternal becoming. The dawn of the new age continued moment by moment, choice by choice, transformation by transformation without end. The end.